Değerli katılımcılar, konferansımızın 5. ve son oturumuna başlıyoruz. 5. oturumumuz 21. yüzyılda Türkiye'de Kürt kimliği. Hepinize iyi dinlemeler.
Efendim, son oturuma başlıyoruz. Benim mülkiyede öğrendiğim ve hiç unutmadığım kavramlardan bir tanesi de aşırı istihdam kavramıdır. Aşırı istihdam biliyorsunuz işsizliğin tam tersidir. İşveren işçi arar bulamaz. Herkes iş bulur, işveren işçi bulamaz. Memnuniyetle görüyoruz ki bir kere daha tekrar edeyim, arkadaşlarım da söylediler. Salonun böyle dolu olması, milletin yerlere oturması, aşırı istihdam halinde olması çok memnuniyet veriyor. Gene tekrar olmak üzere çok önemli iki şey. Bir, cep telefonlarınızı kapadığınızı bir kere daha kontrol ediniz. Bir de çıkışların arkadan olduğunu unutmayınız. Efendim bugün Martin von Brönnisen'le başlıyoruz. Benim uzun yıllar önce başlamış arkadaşlığımın devamı iki solumda oturuyor. Şu anda hocalık yaptığı üniversitede okumuş, Utrecht Üniversitesi'nde. Ne okumuş derseniz, kafası biraz karışık, fizik, matematik ve antropoloji, sosyoloji okumuş. Ondan sonra 78'de doktora tezini yazmış. Ondan sonra Türkiye'de özellikle Kürtler arasında bir totem olmuş. Şeyh Devlet, iki ayrı yayın evi tarafından yayınlandı. Sonra Evliya Çelebi Diyarbakır'da var. Kürdistan üzerine yazılar ve Kürtlük, Türklük, Alevilik kitapları var. Yani ben hani espri olsun da bu adam ne güzel espri yapıyor diyesiniz diye bunları söylüyorum. Çünkü Martin von Brönnisen'i tanıtmak için fazla konuşmak gerekmez. Martin, sıra sende Yosmam. Bu sıra sende Yosmam lafını biliyor musunuz? Yani bu gençlerin kültürü çok zayıf kaldı. Ciddi söylüyorum. Nicky Splainy, Maykammer yazardı. O Maykammer serisinin en tanınmış kitabı Sıra Sende Yosmam'dır. Bunu da benden öğrenmiş oldum bugün. Martin, buyurun.
Thank you, Basketball. I apologize to those who had hoped I would be speaking in Turkish. I think I express my ideas more easily in English, and because we have very good translators, I shall be speaking in English. I am impressed and a little bit afraid to see so many people in front of me. Of course, I'm very happy that so many people show an interest in what we are going to say in this panel. I'm especially happy to meet someone who has been my friend for 42 years and who many times when I went to Ankara, I was thinking of Ankara as the city of Ahmet Kardam, and I'm so glad to see that he's here. Thank you, Ahmet. The panel that we have this afternoon is called Identities and Nationalisms of Kurds in Turkey in the 21st Century. Well, I will try to say a few things to that topic, but from time to time I will leave the 21st century, of which I do not know very much. And also I shall not restrict myself to Turkey, because I think for any Kurd in Turkey, what happens in Iraq or in Syria, Rojava, I mean, everyone knows Rojava. Even Turks in Turkey know Rojava now. What happens in Rojava, of course, is important to the identity of the Kurds of Turkey. The same is true to a somewhat lesser extent for the Kurds of Iran, who are represented here by my friend Abbas Wali. Only recently Turkey had elections, and several analysts after the elections plotted maps to show which party had won in which part of the country. And these maps this time, more than in all previous elections, showed a very clear division of regions where the BDP was the winner and the rest of the country. And several analysts pointed out that these elections had shown the solidification, the strengthening of a real Kurdish area in Turkey. When you plot the results on the map, it is as if there are two parts of Turkey. There is a part where the BDP is the leading party now, and there is the rest of Turkey. Now that is interesting. One analyst, Cuma Çiçek, who is a political scientist in Paris, wrote an interesting analysis first about how these different regions had gradually acquired a clear Kurdish political identity. And then he pointed to a number of provinces bordering on this Kurdish region, let's say from Antep, Adıyaman, Malatya, Kahramanmaraş, up to Sivas, Erzincan, and all the way to the parts of southern parts of Erzurum, of which he said this is a region that has a historical Kurdish identity and a cultural Kurdish identity, but not a political Kurdish identity. Now, I think that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure whether he is right, but it's an interesting thought. Let's look, what would it mean that this region has a historical or a cultural Kurdish identity? And is it thinkable that this region also will in some time have a political Kurdish identity? Can we imagine a much bigger Kurdish region or a bit bigger Kurdistan in Turkey? Now, what strikes you if you look at these provinces, in the first place, when you mention the name, Maraş, Malatya, and so on, that there is a large Alevi population in these regions. And some of these Alevis speak Kurdish or they speak Zazaki, and some of these people consider themselves as Kurds sometimes, but many others are convinced that they are not Kurds but that they are Turks or something else. In the northern parts especially, in parts of Bingöl and north of Diyarbakir, in Erzurum, you find people who speak Zazaki, and some of them think, yes, they used to be considered by the Ottoman state as Turks, which you find if you look at the historical documents, they're considered Kurdish tribes, but they themselves, because they speak Zaza, sometimes think that they are a little bit different from the others. And these regions have generally not voted for the BDP. Now, does this mean that they don't have a Kurdish, well, they clearly don't have a Kurdish political identity, but what about their cultural identity? Is there an objective way of saying whether the Kurdish-speaking Alevis or Zazaki-speaking Sunnis are objectively Kurds? I don't think we can do that. We can only point out that in the past some people, outsiders, have considered them as Kurds and others have not. I think the map of the election showed that there is, among the people who are potentially Kurdish, and well, for a long time in Turkey you couldn't use the word Kurd or Kurdistan, so you said Doğu or Doğulu. And so there's the general idea that East and Kurd is more or less the same. Now that's a very dangerous idea because the East is much bigger than the politically, the area's political Kurdish identity. The East considers much more. And in fact, many people in Western Turkey, when speaking loosely, used to refer to the whole area as that's where the Kurds come from. That's a very backward region. When people started migrating to Ankara, they didn't ask what language do you speak, but they said these guys come from East or Southeast Anatolia. The Kurds are gradually occupying the cities. I remember someone telling when Özal became president, I'm not sure whether he was making a joke, but he said, Kürtler şimdi Çankaya işgal ettiler. For many people, Özal was a Kurd. We know that he had one Kurdish grandmother and the rest of his ancestors had probably different ethnicities, but he was at least a potential Kurd. Now I guess in the whole of Turkey there are many potential Kurds, just like there are many potential Turks, and many people who have ambivalent identities that can be mobilized one way or the other. 20 years ago, at the request of Hamid Bozaslan, I wrote an article about Kurdish nationalism and all the competing identities. And I made much of what I think in the 1990s was an important identity struggle. Both the Alevis and the Zaza speakers made a great effort to distinguish themselves from the mainstream Kurds. And I tried to bring this in connection with one of the many theories about the emergence of nations. Anthony Smith, a famous, the editor of Nations and Nationalism, or the founder, had this idea that initially you have groups of much smaller local identities. They can be tribes, and we know that in the past, and even sometimes up till today, for many people, belonging to the tribe is the primary definer of your identity. That is where your real solidarity belongs. Your asabiya, I think you used the word asabiya the other day, even Khadoun's asab. The real asabiya is in the tribe. There is also an asabiya of the region where you come from. As we know, hemşerilik, and not only for Kurds, hemşerilik is quite important to people in Turkey. There is an interesting study on Malatya, the elites of Malatya. In Malatya you have Turkish and Kurdish, Sunni and Alevi people, among whom in Malatya itself there is always competition and rivalry. But once they go to Ankara or to Istanbul, there is a hemşeri association in which, because they communicate with each other because they come from the same region. So region is another important identity in the area we're speaking about. Religion obviously is another one. Now, how do nations or larger solidarities gradually emerge? It's an interplay between elites in which they decide to ally themselves with one group than the other. Now, if you happen to be a Kurmanji speaker and you belong to a large tribe with a long history, a well-known tribe, known as a Kurdish tribe, and you are a Sunni Muslim, there is a rather obvious identity for you to belong to. There is the larger, the Üst-Kimliği of being a Kurd. But if you do not belong to these majorities, if you speak a different language, for instance, you're born in Istanbul and your mother tongue is Turkish, although you think your family may have Kurdish roots, I mean, there are two forces pulling on you. You, on the one hand, pull towards a Turkish, and on the other hand, pull towards a Kurdish identity. If you have a Zaza as your mother tongue, or if you're an Alevi or a Yazidi, and especially at moments or in regions where there has been tension between the Sunni majority and the Alevis, I mean, there is a strong trend to not to identify too strongly with those Sunnis, whether they are Sunni Turks or Sunni Kurds. I mean, many Alevi tribes call their Sunni neighbors Turk. They may be Kurdish speaking, but because they're Sunni, they're called Turk. In other regions, the word Kurd has the same connotation. The tribe names itself by its tribal names, but the neighbors who are Sunni, they are Kurd. So this group tries to distinguish themselves from both Turk and Kurd. Now, this is rather difficult for people in search of a national identity. Usually we think of language, religion, and territory. I asked Baskin, how do I translate territory? Toprak, you said. Toprak. Those are important symbols of your identity. But as we have seen, these symbols may unite just as well as they may divide. I mean, as long as you speak the same language, okay, but many other Kurds happen to speak not the majority language. So are they then less Kurdish, perhaps? when the PKK started organizing, I think they must have been aware of this difficulty because they never used Kurdish in the first years. All their publications, all their communications were in Turkish. That's an interesting way of circumventing the problem of, do we choose Kurmanji or Zazaki or any of the other minority languages? Nowadays they have shifted to Kurdish. Kurdish has become very important. So there has been a choice to make Kurdish, the Kurdish language, an important symbol and an important item in the struggle for recognition. That's a dangerous choice, of course, because it runs the risk of alienating those who do not have this as a first language. There is no way in which language, religion, and region naturally lead to an identity. There are no natural large identities, I believe. And I firmly agree with Ernest Geller, who says that nations are created by nationalism and not the other way around. It is not so that there's first a nation and then nationalism. No, you have first nationalists who think of a nation as something to be mobilized, and they will create. And in order to create this, they need certain symbols that distinguish it from other nations. That's an important thing. A nation by itself cannot exist. A nation only exists because it is different from another nation. And it has to create a boundary, and it has to have symbols with which it can mark itself as different from those at the other side of the boundary. And there is no reason why language has to be one of these boundary markers. You don't even have a language of your own in order to be a to have a strong national identity. The Irish people have a language of their own, but very few Irish people speak it. Gaelic is, and it's hardly used as a symbol. It is a strong Irish identity, which is obviously not based on language, but on a memory of a common history, a common struggle against the English, and so on. So the other symbols may be equally important. Now, the consolidation of national identity, as we have seen, is taking place in Turkey among the Kurds. It has needed common myth, common symbols, and common enemies. Now, the myth now rose. Another important event, Halabja. I think Halabja is an important symbol that unites not just the Kurds of Turkey, but it's a symbol that crosses all the boundaries. It happened in Iraqi Kurdistan, but it was an event of which we have photographs, which are very moving. It's a very emotional event, and it seemed to symbolize that the Kurds were faced by enemies who were out to destroy them. So Halabja became a symbol not only for the Kurds of Iraq, but immediately afterwards I saw here in Istanbul demonstrations. Until now, Halabja is an important symbol for the Kurds. It's almost like modern Jewish identity is deeply shaped by the Holocaust. If there hadn't been the Holocaust, there wouldn't have been such a strong Jewish identity. And I think Halabja does to the Kurds something on a smaller scale, no doubt, there's an enormous difference in scale, something similar to what the Holocaust means to a Jewish identity. But it is related also with traumatic memories. Many people have lived smaller Halabjas in their own environment. So Halabja is a thing that you can easily identify with. For the Kurds of Turkey, I think the prison in Diyarbakir is an important symbol. And I think these symbols have helped shaping just as much, and perhaps more, than religion or language does. I often have referred to Frederick Barth, an anthropologist who writes about what is an ethnic group and how are ethnic groups defined, and he emphasizes that it is not culture that defines the ethnic group. An ethnic group is not a group that has a certain culture and it is distinguished from people with another culture. No, he says we have to see it as a phenomenon of interaction with other groups. And the important thing, what makes an ethnic group is the boundary that separates it from other groups. every group defines itself against a number of other groups at the other side of that boundary. So identity is defined in terms of relevant others, ötekiler. And I think for the Kurds, for the modern Kurds of Turkey, I see two important ötekiler, two important others. One is the Turks, or the Turk, and the other is the Iraqi Kurd. I think both have had an impact on how Kurds of Turkey think about themselves and think about their own political projects. One of the most interesting things is that in the past 2 decades, the Turk has changed. We used to have a monolithic, homogeneous Turk. And Kurds had to say that we are not that Turk. And you got an identity statement on the part of the Kurds, which was almost as strict as the monolithic Turkish statement of this is a Turk. Now, almost every Turk of the younger generation has been digging into the past of the family. In 2004, Fethi Çetin published this famous book, Anne Anne. But I think in many families we have Anne Anne who were not only Armenian, but scratch a Turk, I always say, and you find at least several other ethnic groups in their family past. And there is an increasing awareness of this diversity within the community that is generally called Turk. As a response, I think, the Kurds have also a less strict definition of Kurdishness, have come to accept also variety in their own ranks. Turkish identity has been deconstructed. Kurdish identity may be to some extent also be deconstructed. And it's only where we have these very ambivalent groups who say, well, perhaps we are not Kurds, or we do not want to be Kurds, that the strictness remains. Zaza and Alevi identities in the past 20 years have become quite solidified. There's a stronger sense of identity, and they have become institutionalized. There's various institutions like journals, associations, and even now in university, there's university departments teaching Zaza, at least 2 in Turkey. In Bingöl we have 2 departments. Oh my God, sorry, I'm only telling you things that you already know. Let's see if I have something. I stay with language. I mean, on the part of all the 4 countries among which Kurds have lived, there have been various forms of assimilation by teaching another language. Kurds have learned to think in another language. Even in Iraq, where Kurdish was not banned, political thought was almost always in Arabic, because you discuss in the major cities, you discuss with colleagues who are Arabs. So the political language of the Iraqi Kurds was shaped by Arabic debates. The political language of the Iranian Kurds was to a large extent shaped by dialogues with people in Iran. And similarly, Kurds in Turkey have had their political education in Turkish. Now, in the past 20 years, I see there has been a certain, what I might call de-assimilation. There has been a tendency to move away from the dominant language and to create a political discourse in Kurdish. If you look at Iraqi Kurdistan, this is very clear. I tried to learn Sorani in 1975, and now I don't understand it because all the words have changed. In 1975, many of the terms they used were derived from Arabic. And like the difference between contemporary Sorani and the Sorani that I learned then is almost like between Ottoman Turkish and modern conservative Republican Turkish. In Turkey, we find that many of the political activists whose thinking was in Turkish have, thanks to those who were in Sweden and developed a modern urban Kurdish language, have been learning how to express political ideas not only in Turkish but now also in Kurmanji. I think most of the people in Turkey, most of the Kurds in Turkey still use Turkish in everyday life, but an increasing number of people who used not to speak it now speak a very good Kurmanji, including people whose mother tongue was not Kurmanji at all, but Zazaki or Turkish. So, because language has been chosen as an important symbol, it has become important to be able to express all important ideas in that language. We find books are published with the sole aim of proving that you can say certain things in Kurdish and that it is a good and a beautiful language and it's capable of communicating effectively. Now, we know that of the main languages, let's forget about Zazaki, but we have Kurmanji in Turkey, and there is already many varieties of Kurmanji. And we do not yet have a real standard for Kurmanji. But with more and more publication, gradually a standard will emerge, even without state intervention, I think. There will be prestigious journals that set a standard. In the south, in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Iran, we have Sorani as well as Kurmanji. There have for a long time been efforts to create a single standard language, to unite the two, because currently Kurmanji and Sorani are at least as different from one another as English and German. People have tried to find a common language. Others have tried to speak Kurmanji in such a way that the Soran will understand it by carefully choosing your vocabulary and not having too complex syntax in your sentences. Soran have learned to speak a Sorani that the Kurmanji can understand, but the languages remain different. Now, interesting, since the 1990s, since we have a sort of state in South Kurdistan, and since this state in South Kurdistan lives under the protection of Turkey, we see an interesting shift. The government has recently decided to have only one standard language. In official communications, only Sorani will be used. Now, I have a suspicion that this was done to make sure that Turkey is not too worried about the development of the Kurdish language. If only Sorani is stimulated, and if the people in the north of Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurmanji speakers, also start using Sorani, and don't forget, the Barzani family who leads that part of Iraqi Kurdistan is speaking Sorani. By background, they're Kurmanji speakers, but they have shifted to Sorani. So I see that Sorani will be the language of all the Kurds. Okay, I'm going to finish one sentence, sorry. And we will end up at two different Kurdish regions. In the south, a Kurdish region speaking Sorani, almost exclusively, at least officially. In the north, a Kurdish region speaking Kurmanji, and these two regions will be less and less able to communicate with each other as collectives. Both will be communicated, but they will be communicating by Ankara. Ankara will have two Kurdistans. Ankara will have an Iraqi Kurdistan as a protectorate, which is Sorani speaking, and there will be a Turkish Kurdistan, which is Kurmanji speaking, which is politically totally integrated in Turkey. I'm afraid I have to stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Efendim, bir Kürdoloji profesöründen sonra kendisi İranlı Kürt olan bir başka Kürdoloji profesörüne söz vereceğiz. Abbas Vali. Kendisi İran'da Tahran Üniversitesi'nden mezun ve 2005'te de Erbil'de Kürdistan Üniversitesi'ni kurdu. Türkiye'de en çok tanınan kitabı Kürt milliyetçiliğinin kökenleridir. Ayrıca Kürdistan Cumhuriyeti ve kapitalizm öncesi İran kitapları da yayınlandı. 2008'den beri Boğaziçi Üniversitesi'nde hocalık yapıyor. Buyurun efendim.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to start, as it is customary, with a note of thanks for the organizers of this conference. They have gone beyond the call of academic duty to make such a wonderful conference. And I would also like to thank you all. In such a great day, you have come here to listen to us. So thank you all. I'd like to start with a number of issues which has been shunted about in the course of the discussion since yesterday. The question of identity, the question of sovereignty, the issue that was raised today, the founding moment or the founding act, and above all, the relationship of the self and other. Before I go to the discussion of Kurdish identity, maybe it is kind of illuminating if I make some comments about this. It may help to elucidate the question. Why I'm going to make this a necessary task for myself is because I believe that in Turkey, talking about Kurdish identity spans a period of 100 years, nearly 100 years. And in this 100 years, we have gone from a process of suppression and denial of Kurdish identity, come to this day to what is often referred to as the partial recognition of Kurdish identity. This very long process has been very painful, has been very costly, it has been very bloody, and has been very destructive. The outcome that we have today is a historical fact. It is born out of history with all pains and, if you like, all the necessary, if you like, developments that brings this kind of outcomes to fore. Now, today, as like yesterday, we talked about identity, and one of my colleagues here today was chairing the meeting. She rightly said that identity always presupposes an other, and that identity always is a relationship of self and other. This is absolutely correct, and at least ever since Hegel's phenomenology, we know all that identity always requires an other, and other is the self, is the means and instrument of self-recognition. This has always been there, it is there. But what is, however, not said, and I think it is important to be said here, is that what does actually put the self and other in front of each other? What is it that makes a self to have another, and why the self is using the other as means of self-recognition? In the context of Turkish history, it is not difficult to look at that. In my opinion, what creates the conditions of modern identity in Turkey as elsewhere in the world is the dominant power relationships. So what really locates the self and other as the two poles of an identity with the constitutive and the constituted sides to it are the existing power relationship. These power relationships in Turkey as of 1924 are the power relationships of sovereignty. This leads me to discussion of another issue which was again raised today, has bearing to what I am saying, but it was left somehow not or left inconclusive in that respect, and that is the idea of a founding moment. Founding moment of the state is the founding moment of the nation. The founding moment of the state is the moment of the birth of the nation. And nation itself is a very curious concept in political philosophy. It is a concept which is fundamentally unable to constitute. It is fundamentally unable to ground. It needs to be grounded. It needs to be constituted. And this is one of the paradoxes of the democratic theory. I recall here, since you are all mostly students of politics and sociology, to very early days of discussion of democratic theory. I would like to recall Rousseau's social contract. Rousseau in Social Contract very aptly says that once the process is concluded, the cause and effect change their place. By cause and effect changing their place, he basically says that the nation which was supposed to found the state, in fact, is now being constituted by the state itself. And this is exactly the story of the founding moment of 1924. But what Rousseau doesn't say here, and democratic theory cannot say, is this: that the founding moment of the state is also the moment of the birth of its other. This other is hidden away from history, as the Kurds were hidden away from history by the constitution and by the force of arms. And being hidden away from history is also very much is in the very structure of founding act, which is the structure of sovereign power. Here we have the moment of the birth of the nation and the moment of the birth of the other of this nation. But the nation speaks the language of the state through the state, but then the other of the nation is suppressed. The relationship of the self and other here, I have in my writings have formulated as being the relationship of denial and suppression and resistance and quest for recognition by the Kurds. This has been a perpetual cycle of violence which is born out of this founding act of the state. I have called this the dialectics of violence. Dialectics of violence has had underpinned Kurdish identity and the relationship of the Kurd to the sovereign power in this country. And the dialectics of violence has also a fundamental consequence for the very idea of identity here. Once again, I want to say that when an identity is totally denied, when an identity is forced to assimilation, when an identity is subjected to violence, there are two forms of violence being operated here. Here I invite you to arguments put forward by the late French philosopher Derrida. Derrida talks about the violence of the founding act in two ways. One of them he calls the performative violence, which is the violence of the state, which is operating through the military, through the organs of the state. But then there is also what he calls the interpretative violence, which is the violence of building a wall of silence around an identity and its language. This wall of silence is very much part of the structure of the language of the sovereign. You can see from 1924 up to 1994, this wall of silence built around the Kurdish language and built around the identity of the Kurd. But the question is this, that shall we say that this silence is external to the language of sovereign, or shall we say it is internal to it? My argument following Derrida is this, that this silence about the language of the Kurd, the very situation that a language which is being spoken but it is not being heard, it is being spoken but it is not being written, a language which is never can translate images to words and words to voices. This language is suppressed in this wall of silence. And this wall of silence is very much part of the structure of language. I emphasize this because this is going to be very important in any constitutional arrangement where we are going to talk about the idea of official language. The moment we talk about official language, we forget about the fact that this silence is part of the structure of language. We must forget about the idea of official language, and I will come back to that. This story, we have seen it, and I don't want to go through it, and you know it better than me from 1924 up to today. Today, we have a situation in which the Kurd speaks. The Kurd speaks, and his spoken word is being heard, and it writes, allowed to be right. The interpretative violence has been removed, not completely, but significantly. But performative violence is still there. That is why I call it a partial recognition of Kurdish identity under the present peace process. The present peace process, in my opinion, has to be welcomed. It is very important, if not for everything, for the fact that it actually has stopped the war. But has it stopped the war? Has it stopped the violence? Does it mean that this violence actually has gone away? No, it hasn't. This violence is in the very center of the structure of the concept of sovereignty in this country. This violence is in the founding moment and the founding act. And if the concept of sovereignty has not reworked and reintroduced in the Constitution, the violence of founding act is going to be there, and it's going to raise its head again and again. Therefore, when we are talking about partial recognition does not touch upon this violence which is there. This violence is in the very structure of the sovereign power in this country. Now, I will come back to this because it has very important implications for the debates which are carried out in this country on the question of citizenship. It is commonplace, and a lot of people do argue, and rightly so, including the Kurdish political parties, that one of the solutions to the recognition of Kurd, one of the solutions to the idea of Kurdish identity, recognition, and the respect for Kurdish identity is the reformulation, perhaps a reconstruction of the concept of citizenship. I think that is right. This is correct, but this is an incomplete argument. This argument is not complete, must be completed, and that is this. that majority of these arguments, insofar as I know, I don't claim to know all of them, I know some of them. Majority of these arguments look at the question of citizenship as question of rights. I think this is fundamentally mistaken to talk about citizenship as question of rights. Citizenship is fundamentally question of power. It is not just a question of right. Citizenship is not right, it is right to have right. Citizenship is the right to have right. In order to have right, you have to be given the right to be the full member of the community in the first place. And then talk about citizenship. You cannot hold the idea vice versa. Here I recall a very interesting point that the French political philosopher Balibar makes. Balibar says, and in my view very correctly, that men do not make citizenship. Citizenship make men. Men do not make citizenship. Citizenship make men. Because citizenship is directly connected with the identity of political power in the Constitution. Reforming citizenship, you can change the notion, various constituent elements of citizenship for as much as you like. If you do not change the identity of sovereign power in the Constitution, you have not gone a long way. The idea of right to have rights, the idea that citizenship is the rights, and if you give these rights, we are all happily ever after are going to our homes and put our feet up and say, we have solved the problems. This is a very naive position. This is the idea which does not see the problem in the, because there is no right which can start signifying and making effects on its own. Every right, every law, as it is said, always exists outside itself. That means that rights always depend on power. If we do not address the question of political power and stick all our efforts on the question of citizenship, we are not going to go very far. For law to be effective, for rights to start signifying, they must be directly connected to the question of political power. This is absolutely imperative. This is an issue which has been always there. This is always been in the heart of the criticism of what is called the liberal democratic conceptions of law, or if you like philosophically, the new Kantian conceptions of law. They think that law based on norm, which is only applied and that's it. No. Law always requires political power. There is no pre-political right. There is no pre-power citizenship. It cannot be. It will not work. It is not going to answer the question of the originary violence of the founding act, which is in the structure of the concept of sovereignty. Yesterday, my colleague here, who spoke very eloquently, he talked about the democratic deficit. I think it is correct. A lot of things that we have said and are saying, most of our criticism of nationalism, in fact, has very little to do with nation. It has fundamentally to do with the inconsistencies and bottlenecks and the ambiguities of democratic theory. It is the democratic theory which in every every constitution which is built in a situation like Turkey and always tries to connect the identity of the demos to the ethnicity of the dominant section in it. And this is always the recipe for catastrophe. This is said, I agree with that, and I must say that when we are trying to remake this constitution, when we are going to debate this identity and citizenship, we must have second thoughts about democracy and democratic theory. We must be very careful of the pitfalls of democracy and democratic theory. Another point which I would like to add what was said about this democratic deficit yesterday, and that is to do with citizenship. And that is the idea of the relationship between the security of the state and the liberty of the citizen. Very often, in liberal theory, which is the grounding theory of this argument, we see that it has been said that the security provided by the state is a fundamental condition of the liberty of the individual. This is what liberal theory tells us. But this is absolutely wrong. At least at present, this argument must be reversed. What I would say is that the liberty of the individual is the condition of the security of the state. If a government does not have a developed civil society, if it does not have legally grounded rights of individual protected in the constitutions and other mechanisms, it will be very difficult to imagine how that government is going to be secure. It is the liberty of the individual, it is the democratic citizenship which is condition of the liberty. It brings us to another point which was made, and that is this, that do we really need a dominant common identity to have a unity which is necessary for the security of the state? My argument is this, that we do not. What we need is the voluntary participation in society through a democratic conception of citizenship which is de-ethnified, which is not religious, which is not grounded on elements of identity of any of the existing sectors of the society. If you want to call this voluntary participation as the common will, popular will, I will accept it. But I will still believe that if we are to go beyond the present boundaries of very, very problematic democratic theory, we must be able to talk about the idea of voluntary participation in the political process. I think that is fundamentally necessary for reworking the conception of citizenship in this country. Thank you.
Efendim biz de Profesör Abbas Vali'ye teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi bazı Hollandalılar sadece kendileri kitap yazarak Türkiye'yi bölmeye çalışmıyorlar. Aynı zamanda öğrenci yetiştirerek ve onlara da profesör yaparak bu süreci devam ettirmeye çalışıyorlar. Bunlardan bir tanesi de benim sağımda oturan Wageningen Üniversitesi'nden Dr. Joost Jongaard'ın onun Kürdolog olması günahını Martin von Brönes'e borçluyuz. Efendim kendisi Türkçe'de 3 tane, İngilizce'de 3 tane ve bir tanesi de Kürtçe olmak üzere kitap sahibi. Esas olarak Türkiye ve Kürt sorunu üzerine çalışıyor. Mesela Türkiye'de PKK üzerine yazılar yayınlandı 1913'te. Joost, buyurun efendim.
Teşekkürler. Today and yesterday we have been discussing issues of identity, the nation state, post-nationalism. And sometimes the emphasis was on nationalism, and sometimes the emphasis was on post. And yesterday in the final session, there was a question, and I don't recall how it was exactly, but it ran like this: are we obliged to define our future in terms of the nation state? And the nation state is part of political history, is part of our political history, but must it be our destiny? And my contribution of today relates to that question, and I will also give you the answer already, and the answer is no, at least not necessarily. And that is the message, I think, of the project of radical democracy of the PKK. And that's also the subject I'm going to talk about today, that project of radical democracy, which basically falls apart in two sub-projects: the project of democratic autonomy and the project of democratic confederalism. But before I start, I would share with you a few considerations. My contribution of today takes place in a body of work that tries to make sense of the PKK, and it is necessary, I think it's necessary to say that, because work on the PKK tended to treat the organization and its political ideology and strategy as somewhat exceptional in the wider framework of Kurdish politics, of politics in Turkey, or even in the context of world politics. And I think that such a qualification as exceptional should shake us, political, social scientists, should shake us up. Because when something seems bizarre or incomprehensible, this does not say more than that we simply do not understand it. And that we, as social and political scientists, should try to make sense of it, or try to search for the sense it makes, at least for those who are involved. And this also implies that we should treat militants as political actors, endowed with interest and the will to elaborate and to articulate those interests. And trying to understand how concepts and actions make sense for those who are involved implies a critical engagement with the subject of study. And here I would like to make a distinction between critical and between criticism and between critique. Criticism, I think, looks for fault, for what is lacking or incomplete, for wrongs and flaws, for what seems incomprehensible. And criticism can be partial and selective. Critique cannot. Critique refers to a thorough evaluation. As a result, or better as a method, and I cite, critique maintains an intimate relationship with the object it works over. It inhabits the object's terms, takes them as far as they can go, and in doing so, recovers the potentials immanent to a field of thought. End of citation. And critique sometimes can become so intimate to its object that the critic risks being identified with it. There may be a very good example of that is Marx. He affirmatively embraces political economy in his critique, the politische economie. That it's often assumed that capital is a political economy and that Marx is a political economist, which both is not true. In our work, as I said, we try to make a thorough evaluation of the PKK within the context of Kurdish society, within the context of anti-colonial struggle, within the context of the left in Turkey. I will try to make sense of those two concepts, democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy. I will explore its meaning, but I will also want to contextualize the context within wider debates. I would also like to emphasize that the idea of democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy are embedded within a long political tradition of thought and linked to a rich history of practices. And I can't engage with everything, but I would like to give a few examples. For example, when we look to the work of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman and his critique on modernity, at the basis of his critique on modernity is what he says, a separation between the ability to do things, which he defines as power, and the ability to decide, which he defines as politics. And I think when we look to democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy from his perspective of politics and power, we can see, or we could see, a reconnection of power and politics within those two projects. But also when we go to the work of, for example, Michael Hart and Tony Negri, in their critique of democracy as we know it, they state that there is a separation of people from power. And I think that's an issue which has been touched upon by Abbas Vali and others yesterday. And we can analyze democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism as an attempt to reconnect people with power. But we could also look to these two projects with the perspective of Hannah Arendt, who argues that in democracy as we have it, people are separated from one another. And in democratic confederalism, we see the possibility of people standing in front of each other, not being separated from each other, but standing in front of each other. And I'm saying this that in order to emphasize that discussions on democratic autonomy, discussions on democratic confederalism, they link to wider debates in political and social sciences. Throughout Kurdistan, in the democratic autonomous regions in Rojava, Afrin, Jazira, Kobani, but also in Diyarbakir or Mahmur, and even outside Kurdistan, in a city I live very close to, Arnhem in the Netherlands, we have seen the emergence of people's councils. And those involved refer to these councils in the context of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism, which indicates that they are not simply to be considered as local initiatives, but also contribute to a larger project or idea, a way of thinking about doing politics. So let us try to define those two concepts which I have been talking about. Democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism. Democratic autonomy, I think, refers to practices in which people produce and reproduce the necessary and desired conditions for living through a direct engagement and collaboration with one another. This is referred to in Marxist autonomist literature as self-valorization. And according to one of his theorists, Harry Cleaver, the concept of self-valorization, and I cite, provides a useful concept to draw our attentions to struggle that go beyond resistance to various kinds of positive, socially constitutive self-activity. End of citation. A rather difficult sentence. But it points towards a project in which you go from resistance, a fight against, to the positive development of alternatives. Democratic confederalism can be characterized as a bottom-up system of self-government, a process of acting and learning at the same time, but in the context of getting control over one's own living conditions. Democratic autonomy, one could say, is the ability and capacity to have control over one's own production systems and relations of production. It links to the concept of power of Bauman. While democratic confederalism is about the ability to decide, the concept of politics of Bauman. And when a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. When we met the local party leader of the Kurdish BDP in Diyarbakir, he told us that the project of democratic confederalism is developed, and I cite, as an alternative to capitalism, which historically found its ideological organization and political expression in the nation state. End of citation. And also as a replacement, an alternative for the collapsed model of what used to be real existing socialism, which has failed to develop political alternatives. And as a paradigm, the local party leader told us, democratic confederalism is not oriented towards taking over state power or focusing on the state, but on developing alternative forms of power through self-organization. And when the Kurdish PYD forces ousted the Ba'ath regime in northern Syria, Rojava, local councils popped up everywhere. Developed under the umbrella of democratic confederalism, these councils had been active already as a parallel structure of government to that of the state since 2007, organizing justice, mediating conflict, etc. And with the collapse of the state, they came out into the open. And since the summer of 2011, de facto elections for those councils have been held in different cities and towns of West Kurdistan and Syrian areas where Kurds live. The PYD program has officially announced its aim of realizing democratic autonomy, which its charter reaffirms, and adding that it sees the project of democratic confederalism as the general mechanism not only for uniting the Kurds in the Middle East, but also as a model for living together, and as such as an alternative to ethnic and religious sectarianism and fragmentation. It was the imprisoned PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan who initiated debates on democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism among the Kurds, following the work of Muray Bookchin. And in 2004, Öcalan contacted Muray Bookchin through his lawyers, sent one of his manuscripts, and asked Bookchin to enter into a dialogue. Bookchin, already 83 years old, was too sick to accept the invitation, but he sent his regards to Öcalan, and he expressed the hope that the Kurds would be able to establish a free society. And when Bookchin died in 2006, the PKK assembly saluted one of the greatest social scientists of the 20th century. And in his work, Bookchin, he differentiates between two ideas of politics: the Hellenic model and the Roman model, which gave rise to two different imaginaries of politics and understanding government. And the first, the Hellenic model, stands for a participatory democratic form of politics, to which Bookchin himself finds himself close. And the second, the Roman model, stands for a centralist and statist form, which he rejects. And the Roman model, the argument goes, has become the dominant form in modern society, informing the American and French constitutionalists of the 18th century, while the Athens model exists as a counter and underground current. Finding expression in the Paris Commune of 1871, the early councils, the beginning of the Russian Revolution, in the Spanish Revolution in 1936. And the statist, centralist Roman model has a herd of subjects, while the Hellenic model, Bookchin argues, an active citizenship. And Bookchin projected his political imaginary for the recovery of people, of humans as active citizens, onto the idea of confederalism and autonomy. Confederalism defined as the interlinking of communities. And he considered that as an alternative for the nation state. And according to Bookchin, confederalism reaches its fullest development in relation to a project of autonomy when placing local farms, factories, enterprises into local municipal hands. When a community begins to manage its own economic resources in an interlinked way with other communities, and the interlinked way is important. It doesn't think, Bookchin doesn't think in terms of separation, but in terms of living together and in terms of connections. And in this model, the economy is placed in the custody of confederal councils, and is neither collectivized nor privatized. It's in common. And as such, confederalism and autonomy are key notions in Bookchin's radical new configuration of society, as he calls it. And in combination, I said it before, they can be considered as an alternative for and going beyond the nation state. And Öcalan, he developed a similar understanding of confederalism and autonomy. And in parallel with his historical analysis of civilization based on a critique of the state, of the nation state, Öcalan condemned the failure of real socialism and national liberation movements, which were considered to be trapped in the ideas of state and nation state making. And he also critiques his own history, the history of the PKK. Instead, Öcalan, he proposed that project of radical democracy based on those self-governing capabilities of people themselves, and referred to as a transformation, and he referred to the transformation of the PKK from a party that aims at state building into a movement that aims at building a democratic society. So what I try to do is do a close engagement with those concepts of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism as expressed in the work of the PKK and inspired by others. I would end with like to end with a few reflections. Let me say, and I said it already, that democratic confederalism, autonomy, that they are linked to a rich history. But not only to a rich history. We can see examples, projects of democratic confederalism, democratic autonomy elsewhere today, although they are not always referred to in that same words. But I think that the project of the Zapatista in Chiapas are based on a similar idea of democratic confederalism. But also when we look to the work of an international peasant movement, Via Campesina, I don't know if you heard of them. It's a worldwide movement of peasant communities with millions of members. They work according to the same principles. But we can also see examples among indigenous communities in Guatemala or in Bolivia and Ecuador. So that idea of democratic confederalism, autonomy, is also linked to experiences elsewhere, and it's worthwhile to have a closer look at these experiments elsewhere and to compare them with the experiments we are seeing happening today in Kurdistan. Let me end with a final remark. Sometimes a critique we heard on the PKK as giving up on self-determination since it gave up on the idea of establishing an independent state. And I think that we here have to distinguish between self-determination as a principle and establishing a state as a form. There are different forms of self-determination. Self-determination in the sense of being in control. And that's also the project of, in fact, the project of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism about. And I will end this with referring to, in fact, to a citation of one of the people within the PKK, Mustafa Karasu, who says that democratic confederalism is not nation-state building, and it's also not about changing borders. Changing borders is thinking in a statist paradigm. So it's not about redrawing borders. So what is it then about? According to Karasu, the idea of democratic confederalism, people organizing themselves bottom up, establishing relations with one another, is about rendering borders irrelevant. And I think this is one of the meanings, or that could be one of the meanings, of going beyond nation-state building, of post-nationalism. Thank you very much.
Efendim Yavuz'a teşekkür ederiz. Nihayet son konuşmacıyla memlekete dönebiliyoruz. Hatta mahallemize. Çünkü son konuşmacı mülkiye mezunu Doktor Handan Çağlayan. 2 kitabı var. Analar, Yoldaşlar, Tanrıçalar, Kürt Hareketi'nde Kadınlar ve Kadın Kimliğinin Oluşumu ve Kürt Kadınların Penceresinden Resmi Kimlik Politikaları, Milliyetçilik, Barış Mücadelesi. Bu arada araya 2 de ödül sıkıştırmış vaziyette. Penn Duygu Asena ödülü ile Rhonda Williams ödülü. Efendim buyurunuz.
Gibi hocam. Merhaba arkadaşlar. Benim sunumum 21. yüzyılda Türkiye'de affedersiniz Kürt kimliğinin inşasına toplumsal cinsiyet perspektifinden bakmak üzerine. Fakat izin verirseniz sunuma başlamadan önce bir konudaki memnuniyetimi dile getirmek istiyorum. Şimdi içinizde bazı art niyetler diyebilirler ki 2 günlük çok yoğun oturumlarla geçen bir konferansın son oturumunun son konuşmacısı olarak nasıl bir memnuniyetten söz edebilirsin diye. Haklılık payı olabilir fakat memnuniyetimin nedenini açıklayayım. Bu 2 günlük konferans boyunca oturumlarda genellikle toplumsal cinsiyet bir analiz kategorisi olarak sunumlara dahil edildi. Bundan dolayı memnuniyetimi dile getirmek istiyorum ve elçinin şahsında emeği geçen herkese teşekkürlerimi sunmak istiyorum. Vurgumun nedeni şu. Şimdi Sayın Vali konuşmasının bir yerinde şöyle bir şey söyledi. Kürtlerden tarihten saklanan olarak söyledi. Duyulmama ve görülmeme üzerine ifadede bulundu. Aslında bu ifadeyi aynı şekilde kadınlar açısından da kullanılması mümkün. Feministlerin sosyal bilimlere yaptığı önemli katkılardan birisi şu olmuştur. Kadınların tarihten saklanan, görünmeyen mevcudiyetlerini aslında sosyal bilimler alanına dahil etmek olmuştur ve bunun sosyal bilimlerdeki tezahürü genellikle ve kadın şeklinde olmuştur. Hukuk ve kadın, tarih ve kadın, tıp ve kadın vesaire. Fakat esas önemli katkı toplumsal cinsiyet kavramını tıpkı sınıf gibi analitik bir kategori olarak sosyal bilimlere katmış olmalarıdır. Şimdi bizde genellikle aslında bu gelişme olalı 50 yılı aşkın bir zaman geçti. Fakat bizde genellikle bu boyut göz ardı edilir. Hele LGBT bireyler akıllarından bile geçirmesinler ve ciddi önemli meselelerde toplumsal cinsiyet, LGBT vesaire asla gündeme gelmez. Şimdi tabii bizim konumuzu oluşturan Kürt meselesiyle ilgili, Kürt kimliğiyle ilgili konularda görmezden gelme şansı yok. Çünkü Kürt kadınlar çok görünür. Eğer parlamenter mücadelelerinden bahsedecekseniz Leyla Zana'yı görmezden gelemezsiniz örneğin. Bugüne gelirsek Gülten Kışan'a görmezden gelemeyeceğiniz gibi. Ya da çok da malumumuz olmayan müzakere sürecinin malum olan getirip götürücülerini den bahsedecek olursak Pervin Buldan'ı görmezden gelemeyiz. Rojava'dan bahsedildi. Rojava'dan bahsedeceksek de Asya Abdullah'ı görmezden gelemeyiz. Tabii bunlar kamuoyunda adı bilinen politik aktörler. Bunlarla birlikte yıllardır zılgıtlarıyla, ağıtlarıyla gösterilerde yer alan Kürt kadınları görmezden gelmek mümkün değil. Dolayısıyla bu durumda da genellikle ve kadınlar, yani meselenin esasına ilişkin değil fakat spesifik bir bilgi alanı olarak ve kadınlar başlıklarına rastlıyoruz. Şimdi diyebilirsiniz ki nedir? Ya burada sorun olan ne? Sorun olan şu ki bir kere kadınlar bu meselenin bir alt başlığı, kıyısı, kenarı değil, aslında meselenin merkezinde ve içindedirler. Birincisi bu. Fakat daha önemlisi bu 2 günlük konferans boyunca sunumlarda dinlediğimiz konular, kulağımıza çarpan ulus devletler, kimlikler, vatandaşlık, devlet inşası, kimlik inşası, tüm bunlar açısından baktığımızda bu ciddi, önemli, takım elbiseli meselelerden bahsederken aslında aynı zamanda toplumsal cinsiyetten bahsediyoruz. Böyle bir önemi var. Şimdi peki toplumsal cinsiyetle bu meselelerin nasıl birbirine dahli var konusuna ilişkin sürem kısıtlı, çok uzun etmeyeceğim fakat değerli konuşmacılarımızın yaptığı saptamalardan hareketle birkaç örnek vererek geçmek istiyorum. Dün Sayın Krom benim solumdaydı, şu anda salonda mı bilmiyorum. Ulus devletlerle ilgili Fransız devrimine atıfta bulundu, vatandaşlığa, haklar nosyonuna, insan haklarına atıfta bulundu. Aslında bahsettiği kavramlar ve kurumlar tarihsel somut koşulları içerisinde gösterilmiştir ki son derece ataerkil, eril kurumlar ve kavramlardır. Kadınların tarihsel kategorik olarak dışlanmasıyla inşa edilmiştir. Örnek, hocam Abbas Vali de Rousseau'yu zikretti. Rousseau'nun toplum sözleşmesi kuramına ilişkin baktığımızda aslında toplum sözleşmesinin ataerkinin babanın hükümdar olduğu, muktedir olduğu geleneksel formundan erkek kardeşlerin muktedir oldukları modern formuna, ulus devlet formuna bir geçişi ifade ettiği dile getirilir. Hakeza Fransız devriminin bize armağanı olan eşitlik, özgürlük, kardeşlik ki bu kardeşlik, fraternity, brotherhood, Kürtçe'de brati, erkek kardeşliği ifade eder. Mesele sadece tabii kelimelerin kökeniyle ya da cinsiyetiyle ilgilenmek değil. Siyes'in aktif yurttaş, pasif yurttaş, yani kadınların yurttaşlıkla da ilişkileri sorunlu olmuştur. Siyes'in aktif yurttaş, pasif yurttaş ayrımı bilirsiniz ki 2 ölçüte dayanarak aslında mülksüzleri ve kadınları dışlamıştır. Birincisi vergi vermeye, ikincisi ulus savunmasına. Yurttaşlığın ulus savunmasıyla askerlikle iç içe tanımlanması daha başından itibaren kadınların yurttaşlık konumunu sakatlamıştır. Günümüze değin. Tabii sadece bu değil. Şimdi Baskın Hocam konuşurken Türklük tanımına ilişkin dedi ki bazı yasaların soyca Türk olmaktan bahsettiğini söyledi. Şimdi sorayım ben de, soyca Türk olmanın garantisi nedir? Bu soyun Türk olmasının garantisi, anladınız sanırım, siz onu deyin, kadınlar açısından ne ifade ettiğini. Yine bizi biz yapan, biz ve onlar ayrımına dayanıyor kimliklerimiz, uluslar. Peki bu biz ile onlar arasında çoğu muhayyel olan bu ayrımlar nelere dayanıyor? Kamusal alan, türdeşlik alanı. Öyleyse farklılıklarımız daha çok nerelerde tanımlanıyor? Bu sorunun cevabı da daha çok özel alanda ve daha çok kadınlarla masallar, yemek tarifleri, ninniler, değil mi? Dil, hele de ana dilleri baskı altında olan topluluklar açısından bu farklılığın taşıyıcısı ve sürdürücüsü olmak kültürel açıdan esas olarak kadınların omzuna yüklenen yükler. Bu kuru erkekleri vatanı savunma görevini verirken kadınlara da bu vatan için çocuklar doğurma, biz kültürüyle yetiştirme uzağımızda değil, halen bile Başbakanımız, sevgili kız kardeşlerim, sizlere acı içinde bir kardeşiniz olarak hitap ediyorum. Lütfen 3 çocuk doğurun, yoksa milletimizin kökü kazınacak derken kendileri aslında hem milliyetçilik alanından hem toplumsal cinsiyet alanından milliyetçiliğin kadınlar için anlamından konuşuyor demekti. Son olarak Tanıl sabah konuşurken bir pseudo Türklükten bahsetti ve bunun aynı zamanda homofobik bir tanım olduğunu söyledi. Bu da sadece kadınlar açısından değil, LGBT arkadaşlar açısından da bu millet kurgusunun projesinin sorunlarına dair sanırım çok şey söylüyor. Dün Maria Holt yine sanırım salonda yok. Mısır devrimi bugünden bahsederken aslında geçmişe gitti ve 20. yüzyılın başlarında Mısırlı kadınların kamusal alanda etkin varlık gösterdiklerini söyledi. Bu sadece Mısır'a ilişkin değil. Bizde de devlet feminizmi denilen bir dönem vardır bilirsiniz. Aslında ulus devlet inşa süreçleriyle ve bunun modernliğinin göstereni olmayla ilgiliydi kadınların bu şekilde kamusal alana çıkmaları. Elbette ki kazanımlar oldu fakat ciddi maliyetler pahasına bu maliyetleri Deniz Kandiyoti Özce şöyle söyledi. Kurtulmuş ama özgürleşmemiş dedi. Son bir şey de özellikle Beyaz Türklükten bahsedildi sabah oturumunda. Bu meselenin özellikle sömürgeci söylem ve pratikler ile sömürge karşıtı mücadeleler açısından da çok ciddi anlamları var. İki örnek vereyim. Birisi sömürgeciler geçmişte ve günümüzde de sömürge topraklardaki, ülkelerdeki mevcudiyetlerini genellikle sömürge ülkedeki kadınların maruz kaldıkları ataerkil şiddete, yani siyah erkeğin siyah kadına uyguladığı şiddete ve ataerkil baskılara dayandırırlar ve kendi mevcudiyetlerinin meşruiyetlerini de beyaz adamın ya da kadının siyah adamın elinden siyah kadını kurtarma gayreti olarak lanse ederler. Aynı zamanda sömürgeci edim bir kadınlaştırma edimidir sömürge erkeği açısından. Hal böyle olunca sömürge karşıtı mücadelelerin de toplumsal cinsiyet içerimlerinin hayli yoğun ve kabarık olması kaçınılmazdır. Daha fazla uzun etmeyeyim. Tüm bunlar bize milliyetçi kurguların, söylemlerin ve pratiklerin kadınlıktan, kadınlardan, erkeklikten ve erkeklerden, heteroseksizmden uzak bir şey olmadığını, aksine tüm bunların onun merkezinde yer aldığını gösteriyor. Peki, tüm bu söylediklerimden şu sonuç mu çıkıyor? Yani kadınlar bütün bu süreçlerin kurbanlarıdır. Dün ilk oturumun ilk sunumunu Simten Coşar yaptı. Hayli yoğun ve güçlü bir sunumdu. Simtem'e dayanarak elbette ki hayır demek istiyorum. Simten böyle toptancı bir kurban yaklaşımını reddetti ve şundan bahsetti. Eklemlenmeler, reddetme ve aşındırmalar. Böyle tanımlamanın daha yerinde olacağını düşünüyorum. Dün yine Sayın Efraim Milli konuşmasında Kürt kadınlardan söz etti ve söz ederken de şunu söyledi. Kürt kadınlar Kürt siyasi hareketi tarafından belirlenmemiştir, manipüle edilmemiştir. Aksine manipüle etmişlerdir ve hareketi belirlemişlerdir dedi. Ben hem sunumunda Sinten'in saptamalarına dayanarak hem de Sayın Mimli'nin saptamasına ek olarak aslında Kürt kadınların aynı zamanda Kürt kimliğinin tanımlanmasına da müdahil olduklarını söyleyerek devam edeceğim. Bununla ne söylemek istiyorum? Önce birkaç değinmede daha bulunayım. Birincisi, bütün kolektif kimlikler gibi Kürt kimliği de öyle ebedi, ezeli bir kimlik değil. Sürekli bir inşa sürecidir. Dolayısıyla yeniden tanımlanmaktadır ve sürecin aktörlerinin, yani bu kolektivite içerisindeki aktörlerin ister sınıfsal ister toplumsal cinsiyete dayalı kendi aralarındaki mücadelelerle de aynı zamanda belirlenmektedir. Birincisi bu. İkincisi, bahsedeceğim Kürt kimlik inşası esas olarak Kürt siyasal hareketinin Kürt toplumunu mobilize etmesiyle oluşmakta, tanımlanmakta ve yeniden tanımlanmakta olan bir kimlik inşasıdır. Sınırları bu. Bu kimlik inşasının belirleyicileri esas olarak Kürt siyasal hareketinin ideolojik söylem ve pratikleri. Birincisi bu. İkincisi, kadınların Kürt siyasal hareketine katılımları ve üçüncüsü de bu iki etkenin karşılıklı olarak birbirlerini ve toplumu dönüştürmeleri süreci olarak ifade edilebilir. Bu sürecin benzer ulusal kimlik inşa süreçlerine hem benzerlikleri var fakat oldukça özgün yanları da var. Benzerlikler bütün diğerleri gibi kurgudur, bütün diğerleri gibi bir aile. Biz bir aileyiz, biz büyük bir aileyiz ve bütün diğerleri gibi bu ailenin kadınlara, erkeklere, aşka ve sevgiye dair söyleyeceği pek çok şey var. Farklılıkları ne konusunda ise esas olarak kadınlar kültürün, yani bizi biz yapan şeyin otantik özünün taşıyıcıları olarak tanımlanmıyorlar. Esas olarak kuşkusuz böyle tanımlayan söylemleri bulmak mümkün. Fakat Kürt kadınlar esas olarak Kürt kültürünün taşıyıcıları olarak değil, Kürt ulusunun biyolojik rahimleri olarak değil, vatan toprağıyla özdeşleştiren kutsal anneleri olarak değil, fakat ne olarak? Politik mücadeleye katılarak yeni Kürtlüğü inşa eden aktörler olarak bu söylemde ön plana çıkıyorlar. Yani Kürt kadınlarının daha çok aktif katılımcı rolleri. Hangi alanda? Siyasal alanda, askeri alanda. Askeri alanda derken birazcık göndermeyi de aslında kadınların demin yurttaşlıkla ilişkilerinin ve toplum sözleşmesinden dışlanmaları konusundaki saptamalarıma göndermede bulunuyorum. Bu söylem erkekleri vatanı kurtarmaya çağırmadığı gibi kadınları da kurtarılacak vatan toprağına indirgemiyor. Bunun yerine her ikisi beraber vatanı tırnak içinde kurtarmaya çağrılıyorlar. Başka bir ifade ile toplumsal sözleşmeyi yapmaya birlikte çağrılıyorlar. Yani aktif yurttaşlar olmaya, bu anlamda yeni bir yurttaşlık tanımı olarak da nitelenilebilir. Bu yönüyle klasik milliyetçi kurgudan farklı bir kurgu ve katılım modelinden söz etmek mümkün. Derseniz ki bunun arkasında ne var? Dört şeyin altı çizilebilir. Birincisi, Kürt siyasal hareketinin ideolojik, yapısal özellikleri, onu ortaya çıkan toplumsal doku ve sol seküler yapısı. Erkekleri ve kadınları geleneksel aile bağlarından ve namus engelinden özgürleştirerek harekete geçirmeyi zorunlu kılan mobilizasyon stratejisi. Yani irade yönü de var fakat zorunlu kılan şeyler de var. Bir diğer neden gündelik hayatın ve tabii ki verili toplumsal cinsiyet rejiminin olağan akışını imkansız hale getiren savaş koşulları, gündelik hayatın, gündelik kadınlık, erkeklik rollerinin alt üst olmasına yol açan köy boşaltmalar, göçler, kayıplar, aklınıza gelebilecek pek çok etken. Ve son olarak da praksis. Yani kadınların katılımının, Kürt siyasi hareketine katılımının bizatihi hangi saikle katılmış olurlarsa olsunlar, kendilerini dönüştürmesi, eylemin dönüştürücü gücü. Evet, Kürt siyasi hareketinin cinsiyet eşitlikçi bir ideolojik şemsiyesi var ama eylem kendisi kadınları dönüştürdü. Bu namus engeliyle ilgili çok kısa bir iki şey söyleyeyim. Bu mobilizasyon stratejisi derken Kürt siyasi hareketi 80 sonrası öncekilerden ayıran temel özelliği yoksul toplumsal sınıflar içinden çıkmış olmasıydı ve öncekileri aşiret bağlarıyla, mezhep bağlarıyla, cemaat ağlarıyla ve geleneksel elitler olmalarıyla toplumu mobilize edebilmiş olmalarına karşın tamamıyla mülksüzlerin içinden çıkmış yeni siyasal hareketin sadece ideolojisi değil, mobilizasyon stratejileri de farklı olmak durumunda kaldı. Kadınları ve erkekleri din ve benzeri başka bir etkenle değil, haklar söylemiyle geleneksel hayatlarından dışarıya çıkarmanın yolu geleneksel ataerkil aile yapısının eleştirilmesi, bu eski aile, eski Kürtlük. Martin Hocam dedi ki Kürt kimliğinin iki tane ötekisi var. Birisi Türklük, birisi Irak Kürtleri. Ben eski Kürtlük olduğunu düşünüyorum fakat Irak Kürtleri dediğinin kategorinin eski Kürtlüğe dahil edilebileceğini düşünüyorum. Zaman olmadığı için böyle hızlı bu konuyu geçiyorum. Namus engel olmaktan çıkartıldı. Kadınlar ve erkekler birlikte toplumsal ve siyasi mobilizasyon sürecine katılabildi. Bu erkeklik eleştirisi sayesinde oldu, erkeği öldürmek diye bir söylem dolaşıma girdi. Bunun sosyalizmin temel ilkesi olduğu söylendi. Dolayısıyla bunun önemi şu, yeni Kürtlüğün, yani bu süreçte tanımlanan yeni Kürtlüğün klasik anlamda ataerkil bir aile olarak kurulmasını da sembolik anlamda da engelledi. Kadınların dağa gitmesinin Kürt kimliği açısından şöyle bir şeyi var. Dağın Kürt kimliğinde önemli bir yeri var, tarihsel ve sembolik. Ve dağ biliyorsunuz ki sert ve yüksek, tıpkı silah gibi eril bir olgudur. Kadınların tek tek gitseydiler belki kadınların cinsiyeti değişirdi, toplumsal cinsiyeti erkekleşirlerdi ama o kadar kitlesel katıldılar ki onlar erkekleşmediler fakat dağın cinsiyeti değişti. Yani eril olmaktan çıktı. Böyle bir etkisi oldu. Dün Hamit Hocam dedi ki toplumları toplum yapanlar sadece yaşayanlar değil ölenlerdir de. Ben bu anlamda Kürt kadınları ölenler olarak da bu inşaat sürecinde ciddi belirleyici bir yer aldıklarını düşünüyorum. Hocam zaman varsa birkaç cümle daha söyleyeyim, yoksa hemen susayım. Birkaç cümle daha söyleyeyim. Teşekkür ederim. Peki netice derseniz, bu bir güzelleme değil. Elbette ki Kürt ulusal kimliği de bütün ulusal kimlikler gibi, yani milliyetçi ideolojiyle de alakası var ve bu bitmiş bir cümle değil. Yani buradan çok güzel potansiyellerden bahsettim fakat bu bitmiş bir cümle değil. Son söz henüz söylenmedi. Kadınlar açısından da söylenmedi. Önce bunu söyleyeyim. Bu süreç bir Kürt kimliğinin modern bir kimlik olarak tanınmasına olanak tanıdı. Bu cinsiyet eşitlikçi boyutu bence Kürt siyasal hareketinin dünya kamuoyunda sempati ve meşruiyet kazanmasında katkısı oldu. Dolayısıyla bu katkıdan dolayı özellikle günümüzde daha teşvik ediliyor ve görünür kılınıyor. Fakat bu görünürlüğün salt siyasal temsil düzeyiyle sınırlı kalmasının, ondan öte bence Kürt kadınların feminist sözünün biraz daha alanının genişlemesi gerekir. Hani sınırlı kalmasa iyi olur kanaatindeyim. Dünya örneklerinde ve tarihteki örneklere bakarak diyeyim. Evet, notlarımdan seçme yapamıyorum. Sorunuz olursa orada fırsat bilip kalanları söyleyeceğim. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Biz de sana teşekkür ederiz Handan. Şimdi sorular kısmına geçiyoruz. İşi olanlar, çıkmak isteyenler bir arada çıksın ki bir an önce sorulara başlayabilirim. Çıkışların arkadan olduğunu hatırlatmak istiyorum. Çıkışların arkadan olduğunu hatırlatmak istiyorum. Önden çıkanı vurun. Arkadaşlar öpüşmeleri dışarıda yapalım. Namus belasına. Bir an önce çıkın da başlayalım. Hadi. Şimdi arkadaşlar şöyle bir yöntem izleyeceğiz herkesin konuşabilmesi için. Soruları ikiye ayıracağız. Sorular ve korsan bildiriler. Sorular 20 saniyeyi geçmeyecek. Önce bunları beşer beşer alacağız. Ondan sonra bunlara cevap verildikten sonra daha uzun yorum içeren 1,5-2 dakikayı asla geçmeyecek olan ikinci tür sorulara geçeceğiz. Şimdi siz önce el kaldırmıştınız. Kısa sorulara lütfen başlayın.
Tanıtım Bay, ODTÜ Tarih Bölümü. Benim sorum Martin Marmaris'ten olacak. Evet. Son dönemde yani 70'li yıllardaki Kürt hareketinin gelişimiyle 2000'lerin başından itibaren Kürt hareketinin gelişiminde dinin konumu. Teşekkür ederim.
Handan Hoca'ya olacak sorum. Dün yarım kalan kaygılar vardı. Kürt hareketi başarılı oldu diyelim. Bütün emellerine ulaştı. Sonra kadınların yani başarıları geriye sarar mı? Cezayir ve işte Cezayir'de olduğu gibi. Bir de Kürt kadınından bahsediyoruz. Bu homojen bir yapı mıdır?
Kim? Peki ona da şey yaparız. Buyurun efendim. Mikrofonu verelim arkadaşa.
Okay, I just want to thank the panel for a very enlightened presentation. Professor Abbas, you have said what I try to say in a much more eloquent way, and I thank you and congratulate you for that. There's one thing I think is extremely important that you must clarify. The moment of constitution of the sovereign state and the conflation of the ethnos with the demos is a moment of criminality. It's a moment of the genesis of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And this is what was made Ernest Gellner to be profoundly wrong and misleading. In that regard, we must take nationalism out of the equation and deconstruct it. Nationalism can not only mean the creation of a nation state, can also mean all the other things that you quite rightly said. So nationalism has to be de-essentialized from this criminal equation. And I would like you to comment about that. The second question is for a colleague from the Netherlands. We political theorists have a habit of reinventing wheels.
Professor Barry, please shorten your question, only 20 minutes, 20 seconds.
I am shortening it. My question is the following. The socialist tradition has a very detailed, sophisticated analysis of democratic autonomy in the works of the Austrian socialists Otto Bauer and Karl Renner. These works have been forgotten and manipulated in a very cruel way by the present Russian authorities. The notion of national cultural autonomy is not what the Russians mean it is something very different. Why not break with that habit of reinventing wheels and perhaps analyze and use some of those concepts? Thank you.
Thank you. 20 saniye efendim lütfen. Buyurun. Tabii bu üçüncü soru ikinci bölüme aitti.
Soramamaktan çok korktum. Handan Hoca'ya olacak benim de sorum. Bu militarizm hayatın her alanında ve kadını da ötekileştiren bir şey esasında, hani erkeğin savaşabiliyor olması. Bahsettiğiniz üzere kadının dağda olması bu algıyı biraz daha yıktı. Uzaktan gözlemleyen biri olarak soracağım bunu. Abdullah Öcalan'ın Nevroz'daki mektubu, işte kadınlar ve gençler ya da BDP'nin politikası, kadınların eş başkan vesaire vesaire. Bu tarz şeyler bölgedeki kadın algısını nasıl değiştiriyor? Ya da Diyarbakır Diyarbakır'da işte o hızınız 50 limiti yazan yerlerde kadın bir kimliktir yazısı var örneğin. Bu tarz şeyler bölgede nasıl bir algı yarattı? Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi bu 5 soruya cevap verelim. 5 etti değil mi? 4 mü etti yoksa? 4 oldu. Bir tane daha alalım. Başörtülü arkadaş sen buyur.
Okay, my question is going to be to Professor Martin. Thank you very much for your profound presentation. Basically, I wanted to, you mentioned something about nations created are created by nationalism, if I'm not mistaken. My question is going to be, Professor Martin, to what extent do you think nationalism can be associated with religion, identity, and national, and basically territory, the one that you mentioned, and can they exist independently of one another? And thank you.
Efendim 5'ine de teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi buyurunuz konuşmacılar mümkün olduğu kadar özet bir biçimde bunlara cevap versinler. Bir 5 soruluk set daha alalım. Martin buyurun.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, and you too. You both asked about religion. It was on the last page of my prepared text, and I spoke too long in the first half. I put it last because I think it's the most important thing to say. All Kurdish political movements of the 20th century until the 1980s had been secular movements, from Kürt Cemiyeti and Azadi. They were intellectualist movements who were secular. There was no Islam in their ideology. But they tried to reach a population that was deeply pious, religious. So they needed figures like Sayyid Abdul Qadir in the case of Kürt Cemiyeti, Sheikh Said in the case of Azadi, and similarly in later periods. Now in the 1980s we see an important change, perhaps related to events in the wider region, the Iranian Revolution and the jihad against the Russian occupation in Afghanistan, both of which had a deep impact on Kurdish societies. We had Kurds going to Afghanistan to fight the Russians, for instance. Kurdish political movements lived in exile in Iran and were in contact with Iranian Islamic revolutionaries. So what we see in the 80s and 90s is in the first place in Iraqi Kurdistan, but also here and there in Turkish Kurdistan, Islamist movements with an Islamic ideology that also had a Kurdish identity, like the Bezutnawe Islamiyye Kurdistan in the south or Parti Islamiyye Kurdistan here. In the second place, you see also that parties that used to be secular see that there is a shift in political demand on the part of the population, and in order to stay close to the population, they adopt a discourse that is more friendly towards religion. PKK was initially, like everything coming from the left, against religion, period. I think it was in the 4th Congress in 1986 that a self-critique was made, and that is said, well, the population, we have to realize many of our population are pious people, and we have to recognize that, and a much more Islam-friendly discourse was started, and PKK then had Kürt Dindalerin Birliği and that sort of small associations trying specifically to address the religious segments. We see the same in all the other in the parties in the south. Thirdly, we see in the 90s, as a result of the neoliberal reconstruction of the economy of the wider region, the emergence of an Islamic bourgeoisie, middle-class people, entrepreneurial people who still have the regional strong ties to Islam. I think that it is that segment that was most effectively addressed by the AK party in Kurdistan. And it is interesting to see that, do we have one more minute?
You have 2 questions in a way.
Yeah, well, they're very closely related because I think implicitly I'm already addressing your... There was something called Hezbollah. If you're from the side of the PKK or any of the secular movements, you can only see them as a sort of devils. But Hezbollah was a movement that was, in a sense, close to certain sections of the population. There was a period of violence. They have come beyond that. They are now much more a civil society type organization, which appears to have an enormous network in certain parts, for instance, in Diyarbakir. They have been very effectively organizing mass movements, Kutlu Doğum Haftası, not by accident 3 or 4 weeks after the Nowruz movements, and if you look at the photographs, it is almost as if you see the same demonstrations. The huge mass meetings, the only difference is the BDP's green, red and yellow is replaced by white, green and a little bit red. But otherwise they're very, very similar demonstrations, and in Diyarbakır definitely there's a very strong Kurdish sentiment in these demonstrations. I mean, the Mustazaflar Derneği, they were still legal when I visited them 2 years ago. They didn't like to be called Kurdish nationalists. I said, well, basically, you say you're Muslims, but I think you're very much Kurdish nationalists. They don't like the word nationalism, but they have a clearly strong Kurdish identity emphasis in their movement. So, the most recent news in the latest week is that we saw the leading people of the BDP this time joining the Kutluddin Haftar's huge demonstration in Diyarbakır and giving an address showing their willingness to accommodate with the Islamist sentiment. So there seems to be an effort to bring a convergence to the Islamic or Islamist wing of the Kurdish identity movement and the secular wing. Well, I'll not say anything about the possible Alevi responses to that, but you can imagine those. Thank you.
Şimdi bana gelen sorulardan birisi kadınlar elde edilen bu cinsiyet eşitliği açısından elde edilen başarılarda geri dönüş olabilir mi? Bir diğeri Kürt kadınları derken homojen mi? Aslında şu oturumda yapılan sunumlar bile böyle bir homojen ve Kürtlük açısından homojen bir Kürtlük olmadığı sonucunu gösteriyor bize. Kadınlar açısından da hakeza öyle. Ben belki heyecandan ve aceleden söylemedim. Bahsettiğim Kürtlük tanımı kültürel bir Kürtlükten ziyade, yani etnik kültürel bir kimlikten ziyade politik, etnik politik bir kimlikti. Dolayısıyla bahsettiğim kadınlar aslında Kürt kadınlar, politize, yani bu politik hareketin şemsiyesi altında kendini Kürt kadın olarak tanımlayan kadınlar. Böyle bir şey yapayım. Geri dönüş konusu kesinlikle olabilir, yani bunun bir garantisi yok. Her şeyden önce kimliği tanımlama bir iktidar ilişkisi. Yani demin dedim ki bu kimlik hep beraber, bu kolektif olarak bir mücadelenin içerisinde tanımlanıyor. Fakat onun da belli sınırları var. Ve bu eğer bir ulus adına, etnisite adına bir kimlik tanımı yapıyorsanız mutlaka ve mutlaka bu sınırların dışına konacak olanlar ve içerilecek olanlar var. Ve bu içerilmenin belli koşulları var. Bu koşulların sadece Kürtler açısından değil, bütün toplumlarda en fazla kadınlar açısından çıtayı yükselttiği belirtilebilir. Bir diğeri bütün ulusal kimlik inşa süreçleri, ulus devlet inşa süreçleri mutlaka hani geleneğin icadı falan deniliyor ama aynı zamanda unutmalar, unutuşa terk etmeler ve suskunlaştırmalarla birlikte işleyen süreçlerdir. Kürt siyasal hareketi açısından baktığınızda şimdiden bile belki kadınlar açısından suskunlaştırmalardan bahsetmek mümkündür. Dolayısıyla yani bu içeride kalanlar, içerilecek olanlar ve dışarıda tutulacak olanlar açısından baktığımızda şey değil. Yani evet bugün kolektif bir mücadele süreci fakat demin söyledim yani Kürt siyasal hareketi kadınların aktif katılımı istenilir bir şey. Fakat kadınların talepleri ve gündemleriyle hareketin talepleri ve gündemlerinin bu kadar uyumlu olmadığı koşullarda nasıl bir gerilim yaşanacağı ve bu gerilimin ne tür sonuçlar doğuracağını bilemiyoruz. Böyle yanıtlamış olayım sorunuzu. Bir diğer daha deniz, ya ben yanlış anlaşılmak istemiyorum. Doğrusu yani daha derken Kürt kimliği açısından önemi olduğu için dile getirdim ama hani militarizm metaneli bir konu. Hani kadınların silah kullanmalarının toplumsal yaşam içerisinde toplumsal cinsiyet rolleri açısından ne tür dönüştürücü, yani bu çok önemli bir şey söylemiyorum. Esas sorunuza geliyorum. Tüm bunlar toplumu nasıl değiştiriyor dediniz. Bir kere belli bir değişimden söz etmek mümkün. Fakat ben esas vurgunun şu an itibariyle siyasal bağlam içerisinde kaldığını düşünüyorum. Bunun daha toplumsallaştırılması gerekiyor diyerek bağlayayım.
Profesör Vali.
Thank you for your comments about my presentation. I think you are right in that respect about nationalism. Nationalism could be various means to various ends. I agree with that. And I basically look at nationalism as an open field of discourse and practice, and to which discourses and practices from liberalism, from democratic theory, from socialism can be articulated, and various things can be achieved from that. That I agree with that. But basically, I would also, as a form of political struggle, or a form of struggle in the field of discourse, if you like, and the political struggle, I see it as a kind of struggle for definite rights. But here, if you look at my presentation, I didn't, what I wanted basically to say that it is fine, it is very good idea to go at present day Turkey for rights and argue for rights, argue for, if you like, consolidation of those rights and institutionalization of those rights. But one thing we should not lose the sight of the fact that rights are always predicated on power. You see, if we do not do any effort, do not try to change and rewrite the identity of political power, the sovereign power in any constitution, no conception of citizenship which is directly determined by that is going to make any headway toward democracy. This is one point that I was making, that those who are involved in this debate, in my opinion, it's imperative among them to address this issue. If I were involved in this debate, I am not, I would have addressed those issues come what may. But the point is that you cannot separate that citizenship from those rights. That is one, is that you cannot expect an identity which, as our friends, so that it emerges from the founding moment of the state, which is founding moment of a state is really a moment of violence which ruptures the tissue of history, whereby a nation emerges and another ethnicity is hidden away and suppressed. Now, that very same identity becomes the lawmaker. It is the lawmaker. It is making the laws, but the violence behind this law is never talked about it. And my point is this, that how can you, within the given context of democratic theory which is available to us, address this question of the violence behind the law, and always appeal to law to be good, to give us the rights. This is simply a logical impossibility which has to be addressed. And this is the high time in this country for it to be addressed. It is very important to say that the existing means, processes, practices, frameworks of democratic politics are simply inadequate to answer the questions that we are posing. This is the points that I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to be abrasive, I'm not trying to be rude. I am kind of making a kind of warning shot to the intellectuals involved in this debate. That's it.
Teşekkür ederiz. Efendim şimdi ikinci set 20 saniyelik sorulara geçiyoruz. Şunu söylememe izin veriniz. Bu son oturum olduğu için burada bir kişi kalana kadar, soru sormak isteyen bir kişi kalana kadar buradayız. Bütün mesele kısa konuşup başkalarının zamanını almamaktır. Buradan bir buyurun efendim. Kırmızı. Kime sorduğunuzu benim anlayabileceğim kadar açık söyleyiniz.
Benim sorum Sayın Yongerden'e. Demokratik konfederalizmden bahsetti ve bazı örnekler de verdi dünyada, Latin Amerika'dan, özellikle Chiapas'tan bahsetti. Şimdi gerek PKK gerekse Sayın Öcalan'ın demokratik konfederalizmine dair vurgularında özellikle sınırın olmadığını ve aslında bu demokratik konfederalizm sadece Kürdistan için değil, bir Orta Doğu modeli olduğunu sıklıkla vurguluyorlar. Aslında mantıklı olan da o görünüyor Orta Doğu'daki şu andaki durum için. Fakat tam da bunun aksine bir Güney Kürdistan'da bir bağımsız bir küçük ulus devlet kurma gibi bir girişim var ve şu anda demokratik konfederalizmin bir pratik alanı olan Rojava'ya yönelik de aynı zamanda Güney Kürdistan'dan bir saldırı var. Bu kısa sürede iki Kürdistani güç bu anlamda karşı karşıya gelecek mi ya da demokratik konfederalizm bir ütopya mı olacak Orta Doğu için?
Teşekkür ederiz. İkinci soruyu alalım. Buyurun.
Merhabalar.
20 saniye.
İki sorum olacak. Birinci sorum Sayın Martin van Bromliesen'e. Sayın Bromliesen, Türkiye'deki Kürtleri kimliği tanımlarken ötekiler üzerinden tanımladığını söyledi. Bir, Türkiye Kürtleri, iki, Irak Kürtleri olmak üzere. Buradaki, bu nereden kaynaklanıyor? Yani Irak Kürtlerinin üzerinden kendini öteki olarak adlandırıyorlar. İkinci sorum Sayın Abbas Vali'ye. Bugünlerde...
Şimdi yalnız birden fazla soru sorduğunuz zaman başkalarının hakkını yiyorsunuz. İkinci sete geçelim lütfen. O zaman sorarsınız. Ayrıca teşekkür ederim çünkü ben bu soruyu Martin'e soracaktım. Üçüncü soruyu alalım. Buyurun efendim.
Merhaba, sorum benim Martin Bey'e. Şimdi konferansın başlığıyla dolaylı olarak alakalı bir soru soracağım size. 80 sonrası bu Kürt hareketinin ekonomi politiğini değerlendirdiğinizde Kürt burjuvazisi ve Kürt proletaryasını nasıl ayırıyorsunuz ve nasıl değerlendiriyorsunuz? Teşekkürler.
Efendim sağ olun. Dördüncü olarak sizi alalım.
Abbas Vali'ye sormak istiyorum. İsmail Beşikçi Hoca'nın son bir söylemi vardı. Kürtler milliyetçi olmalıdır. Ne düşünüyorsunuz? Fikriniz nedir? Bir de ezilen ulus bağlamında Kürtlerin milliyetçiliği meşru değil midir? Teşekkürler.
Son soruyu alalım. Anlamadım. Alalım ya. Gel.
Başka türlü. Fırat Çapan Hacettepe Üniversitesi. My question is to Professor Brunesen. I want to ask what is the relation between violence and identity and what is the effect of PKK on the Kurdish identity? Does it affect it in positive or negative way? What do you think? Thank you.
Efendim şimdi cevaplara geçelim. Dediğimiz gibi daha önceden de rica ettiğimiz gibi mümkün olduğu kadar kısa. John Garden'la başlayalım. Buyurun efendim.
Thank you for your question about the different political projects in the project of the PKK, focusing on confederalism, autonomy, democratic autonomy, and the one in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is more like a conventional state building project. Of course, they are very different political imaginaries with their very different political strategies. The question is not only if they clash in the future. I think we already see a kind of hidden clash today and over the last few years. It's very difficult for the two to come together and to develop something of a common program, how limited that program may be, for example, about the situation in Rojava. There is a clash between the two already going on. But he also wanted to react to the issue raised by Professor Nimni on the socialist tradition and that there's also a democratic tradition one could refer to. And that's absolutely true, but we also have to add to that democratic tradition was not a tradition the left in Turkey was familiar with in the 1970s. That's also the period in which the PKK emerged from the revolutionary left in Turkey. And what they were familiar with was literature of Lenin, Stalin's analysis of the national question, and in their critique on socialism, or their critique on real existing socialism, that was the socialism they tried to distance themselves from over the last few years. When developing their project of democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy, we see that the PKK is making reference to that other tradition, the utopian socialists in particular, not the Austrian ones, but also to the socialist tradition, which is linked to people like Bakunin, more from the anarchist or utopian socialist tradition. So it is important in the reformulation of their project, but it has not been important in at the time of the establishment of the parties at the time.
Efendim teşekkürler. Şimdi üçüncü set 20 santim diyorum.
Ben de cevap vereyim.
Çok özür dilerim. Martin.
Sağ ol. I found the questions very difficult, so I wouldn't have minded if you had passed me over, but now I have to try. What does it mean that for Kurds in Turkey, the Iraqi Kurds are the other? Well, I think if you look at the historical process, in the late 1950s and the 1960s, when Barzani's movement started, it was of great importance for many Kurds in Turkey who started to rediscovering that they were Turkish, that they were Kurds, and that there was a perspective. The struggle was successful and it stimulated a Kurdish awareness among the Kurds of Turkey. In that sense, people thought of them as the same in one sense, but different. They did things differently, but they were an example to be emulated. In the beginning there was a party formation based on the example of the Iraqi party formation also, but soon in the 60s and 70s the influence from the Turkish left started taking over, and a clear difference in style of political activism started emerging between the Iraqi Kurds and the Turkish Kurds. Now, when in 1991 a sort of almost independent Kurdish little state started to emerge, of course it had again a stimulating effect on the awareness of the Kurds of Turkey. They looked at it as an interesting, at the same time the way these Iraqi Kurds went about things was so different. And when you went there, you felt, on the one hand, you felt you were in Kurdistan, but you felt it was a very strange Kurdistan. So the idea that successes were made, but the state that emerged was not at all like the sort of thing that Kurds here wanted, again gave this sentiment of the same and yet so different. Now gradually, as the struggle in Turkey progressed, we've seen that we have many different political parties, but there's only two major political forces left that define Kurdish identity. One is the KDP of Iraq and one is the PKK. Sad for all the others, but I think these are the two significant ones, and I think for certainly the next decade, those are the ones that will shape the political thought of Kurds even in other parts. The Iraqi Kurds used to have a great impact, a great influence here. I think that has almost disappeared. So there is, in that sense, really a separation in political orientation between these two. That's why I said they're the others. There's much more that can be said about it, but they have remained others, the same and yet so different. But still, when looking at who we are in the background, being different from them, it plays an important part. How do I distinguish, or how do I analyze the existence of a Kurdish bourgeoisie and a Kurdish proletariat? I think in Aga Sheikhan State I wrote something about, I have seen a Kurdish proletariat, but it's not in Kurdistan. It is in the big cities in the West, or it is in Europe. And I've seen a Kurdish bourgeoisie, and they all live in Ankara, Izmir, or in Istanbul. Meanwhile, the situation has become much more complicated, because there is now also a big bourgeoisie living in the Kurdish provinces of Turkey. We may have a small proletariat, very small, but we have a very large sub-proletariat. And I think one of the big problems of the future in Kurdish society will be with this subproletariat. I mean, the children who throw stones and their families, the people who have come from the villages, whose villages have been destroyed, they've come to the cities, they do not manage to get integrated economically in the cities in any satisfying way. And it may take generations for this problem to be solved, or not at all. So, the subproletariat, I think, is the one thing that is the most worrying of the political developments of the past years. The effect of violence, of PKK violence on Kurdish identity. I mean, there was, of course, this early tract, the Kurdistanda Zorun Rolü, in which it was said that, I mean, Kurds will only be made aware of being Kurds if they are forced into that awareness by violence from the state. So we need some violence towards the state, the provocative, repressive violence. And I mean, although it is a very crude theory, I'm afraid, well, I think the theory worked. I think the violence of the state, physical violence, but also all the other measures of the state, violence to suppress Kurdish identity. Let me give one more example. The institution of the OHAL bölgesi, the Olağanüstü bölgesi, which was meant in order to effectively suppress all Kurdish separatist tendencies. But the very existence of such a region makes a dichotomy in Turkey. You have the OHAL bölgesi and you have the rest of Turkey. It's not by accident that the region, if you look at the map, the regions where everyone voted BDP into power in the belediyes is more or less coinciding with the region of OHAL. So Kurdistan was to some extent created by the state's violence, which in turn was a response to PKK violence. So the answer is yes, there has been an impact, although complicated and often not direct.
The answer to the question about Kurds and nationalism and should they be nationalists or not, let me say, day before yesterday when I was coming here, I was reading an article on the aeroplane written by a well-known Turkish sociologist who was analyzing statistical results of the elections. And was talking about BDP and the composition of the voters and how they have voted and their political positions and orientations. What was very interesting is that according to this sociologist's analysis, of the voters, those who voted for BDP, only 2.5% could be classified as nationalists, which, by which I would understand 2.5% of voters who had voted BDP wanted a separate state. That's what you would consider as nationalist. But majority of the overwhelming majority of voters for BDP were of social democratic and liberal democratic orientation, and they were asking for the resolution of the Kurdish question and if you like, ending of this conflict and so on and so forth within the context or framework of the juridical political framework of Turkey. This is very much in line in certain other ways with what has the PKK been saying and preaching, that nationalism without a state and democratic autonomy, realization of rights in ways other than sovereignty and so on. I am in the present circumstances in Turkey, and as a consequence of the long-term struggle here, I think that is a pretty plausible and a good idea. In fact, I am all for it, in a sense that if nationalism means that we can have within the context of a democratic state to be able to be considered as the full citizens of a society with rights and access to, if you like, conditions of implementation of those rights. That is by which I mean that if there is a constitution which reflects not only the dominant ethnicity and identity, but also in one way or another, that is the Kurds' identity as well. I think that is extremely good. That is what should be said, that to that extent, I think Kurds should be nationalists, yes. So I think the time has come, both historically, if you look at the history of nationalism and the history of the creation of the nation states, particularly in our region of the Middle East, so-called. And in this region, if you look at it, its time has come to seriously decouple this idea of struggle for rights and recognition from the juridico-political framework of a distinct or separate or ethnically defined nation state, so to speak. This is, so to that extent, I think in Turkey at present, I think Kurds can be nationalist, but I think the nationalists in lines which is, they have been doing and they're struggling for their rights. And this struggle also at the same time must be meaning, it is imperative, it must be meaning the democratization of the Turkish state as well. Without the democratization of this institution, the conditions of possibility of the realization of Kurdish rights will be extremely slim. Thank you.
Teşekkür ederiz. Efendim 3. sete geçelim. 20 saniyelik soruların. Hanımefendi siz buyurun.
Geliyor mu sesim? Evet. Merhaba öncelikle. Ben Safiye Göker Pamukkale Üniversitesi'nden geliyorum. Sorum Baskın Orhan size ve
Bana soru sormayayım, ben çok konuşmadım.
Tamam.
Konuşmacılara.
Tamam.
Sonra dışarıda konuşabiliriz.
Ben Çağlayan'a çok sevinirim, teşekkür ederim. Birbirine bağlantılı iç içe geçmiş sorular olacak ve farklı bir noktadan bakıyorum ben aslında bazı
Yalnız
şeylere.
20 saniyeniz olduğunu biliyorsunuz değil mi? Birbirine
Aslında,
geçmiş sorular derken.
Evet biliyorum.
Tamam.
Tabii. Şimdi sonun Türk olmasının garantisi nedir dediniz kadınlar açısından? Burada devletin içine düştüğü bir çelişki değil midir bu diye soruyorum öncelikle. Ve beyaz Türk dansında yine kapitalist sistem ön plana çıkmıyor mu? Yani zenginler vicdanlarını rahatlatmak istedikleri zaman kadın ya da erkekler ihtiyacı olanları görüyorlar. Onun dışında kimseyi istemiyorlar. O zaman şu an doğru şeyi mi tartışıyoruz? Var olan etnik kökenleri yok sayan, bugüne kadar ulus devlet adına saymış ülkeler söz konusu. Olumlu ilerlemeler de var. Fakat yönetimlerin başına geçenlere baktığımız zaman şu anki örnekteki gibi işlerine geldiği zaman kullanılmak üzere problemleri raftan alıyorlar. Bu bağlamda kadın, erkek, Türk, Kürt, siyah, beyaz ayrımlarının...
Soru neydi?
Soru geliyor şu an.
Bence onu önceye alsak da ötekileri sonraya alsak.
Yani söylemek istediğim...
Burada bir kişiye ayrıcalık tanırsam kitle beni linç eder. Haklı çıkar.
Özür dilerim, izin vermeyeceğim. Yani söylemek istediğim şu, Türk, Kürt, kadın, erkek ya da siyah beyaz ayrımını yaparken bizler belli bir şeyi kaçırıyor muyuz acaba? Çünkü Türk olarak ben de baktığım zaman belli şeylere ben de erişemiyorum. Kürt, Ermeni ya da farklı halklar gibi. Söylemek istediğim buydu. Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederiz. İkinciyi alalım. Buyurun efendim, siz yanınızdaki.
Merhabalar, Yiğitcan Hocar. Benim sorum Profesör Vali ve Profesör Bölmesi'ne. Sorum da şu, her ikiniz de konuşmanın sırasında birazcık da olsa değindiniz Kürt dilindeki görülebilir bir ya da işte kayda değer bir ayrılık olduğundan. Şimdi hepimiz birazcık görebiliriz ki bu ayrılık esasen Kürt partilerine yansımış durumda. Ben de kısa keseceğim ama. Kürt partilerine de, bazı Kürt partilerine de yansımış durumda. İşte güncel örnek.
Bak sevgili kardeşim, bu ikinci grubun şeyine girer. Soruyu sorun.
Tamam, çok kısa hemen soruya geleyim.
O konferans vermeyin.
Tamam, çok özür dilerim. Bugün KDP'nin Rojava'daki tutumunu, Hendek meselesini göz önünde bulundurarak Orta Doğu'da ileriki yıllarda, yani Türkiye'de Suriye'deki Kürtler bundan rahatsız olmuş durumda. Orta Doğu'da ileriki yıllarda Kürtler için bir ayrılık durumu sürekli böyle devam edecek mi, yoksa bir birlik olabilme, en azından birbirini tanıyabilme açısından daha mesafe almaya devam edebilecek mi? Böyle bir ihtimal var mı?
Üçüncü soru. Buyurun.
Arkadaşın sorusuna benzer aslında biraz Abbas Vali'ye. Bütün Kürtlerin tek dili konuşabilmelerine çok da gerek yok dedi. O zaman entelektüel birikimlerini birbirleriyle nasıl paylaşacaklar? Hangi dil aracılığıyla?
Teşekkür ederiz. Dördüncü.
Öncelikle merhaba, ben sorumu Yongarden'e sormak istiyorum. Yongarden. Az önce eğer yanlış anlamadıysam demokratik konferanizmi şeye bağladınız, kapitalizmi alternatif olarak sundunuz. Yanlış anlamamışım. Peki bu alternatif olarak sunmanız sosyalizmi alternatif olmaktan çıkartıyor mu? Ayrıca demokratik konferanizmi komünizmle bağdaştırabiliyor muyuz? Bir ilişki kurabiliyor muyuz? Teşekkürler.
Sağ olun. Beşinciyi alalım. Sen ikinciyi soracaksın galiba. Sor. Tamam.
Abbas Vali'ye soracağım. Şimdi Kürt hareketleri özellikle 1924 Lozan Anlaşması sonrası ortaya çıkan Kürt hareketleri temel olarak 4 parça Kürdistan'ın nihai olarak birleşmesi ve bağımsız bir Kürdistan devletinin kurulmasını amaçlıyorlar. Bunun öncülüğünde 1950'lerden sonra KDP ve Barzani ailesi yapıyordu. Aynı KDP şu anda bağımsız Kürdistan ilanına hazırlanıyor. Güney Kürdistan bağımsız olması için hazırlıklar yaptığını söylüyor. Ama aynı KDP ve Barzani Türkiye'de...
Soru neydi?
İşte soru bölümüne geçtim hocam.
Sor şu soruyu yahu. Sor da kurtulalım. Yani sen de kurtul, ben de kurtulayım.
KDP ve Barzani Türkiye'de PKK ve Türk Devleti'nin anlaşmasını Türkiye sınırları içerisinde çözmeye kavuşmasını, yine Rojava'da YPG'nin Suriye Ulusal Koalisyonu içerisinde...
ikinci gruba sakladın, olmaz mı? Bir beşinci soru
bitti
alalım.
Hocam, soru bitti.
Yok, bitmedi. İkinci gruba ben seni ilk yazdım.
Soru bitti hocam.
Ya bu tabii ki belki de ilk defa böyle bir uygulama görüyorsunuz ama doğrusu budur. Beşinciyi alalım. Söyle kardeşim.
Merhaba, ben sorumu Cüs'e sormak istiyorum. Demokratik özellik projesi bir ulus devlette uygulanabilecek bir proje mi ya da bu ulus devlete rağmen uygulanabilecek bir proje mi? Teşekkür ederim.
Biz de teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi Profesör Vali'den başlayalım.
Shall I respond?
Please.
Yes, the question of Kurdish language separation.
Yes. The question of, I assume this is a question asked first in the context of Turkey. Well, clearly, Turkey is going to have needs to have a language of administration and so on and so forth. That is there. But I have, my idea is that given equal rights to Kurdish language in terms of education in mother tongues, not education of the mother, educating in mother tongue. Education in mother tongues and so on is a necessary part of this recognition of Kurdish identity. This has raised in some of the discussions I have had with some of the Kurdish politicians about it. This is the idea has, the discussion has been revolving around this, that what is to be done in this relationship, about the relationship between Kurdish and Turkish language. I accept that the Turkish is the language in certain ways, if you can call it dominant language, but constitutionally I am entirely against the idea of using the word of official language. This official language is a problematic concept. It can have dire consequences afterwards. You don't have to use official. My argument was that you can make a very good case why Turkish is the dominant language, is language of, if you like, science, bureaucracy, and so on. Historically has gained this position. But once you constitutionally admit that it is the official language, you make it the language of power. Language of power, when it works, always has to discriminate. This is a power because it has to have dominating effects. You cannot have power work without producing domination and subordination. This is absolute fallacy. This is a fantasy to believe that power can work without producing dominating and subordinating effects. And if the language of power is an instrument of power, it is going to work in this process. Therefore, I am against the notion of official language, but this doesn't mean to say that you have to displace Turkish language from the position it has. In the future arrangements where it's going to be made, you can make a very good historical case for it, rather than juridico-political case for it. You can make a good historical case for it, why Kurdish language, or for instance Persian in Iran. Why Persian in Iran is in a position as it is, because historically has gained this position. But you don't have to put that in the constitution as the official. I am against notions of official language, against the notions of official religion. Official religion is no less repressive than official language. That's why I said that we should look at what we are doing in what context of democracy or democratization. The other point that you were making about the language as a means of unity, I think so far, ironically, despite the fact that Kurdish identity has been fragmented, Kurdish politics has been fragmented, the most important sort of uniting factor, unitarian element in this has been the repression. Now, if the repression is lifted, I think the situation is going to open up. I see simply no reason why that Kurds all should speak with the same dialect. I don't see why Kirmanji or Sorani should become the singular dialect of spoken Kurdish in 4 parts of Kurdistan, whatever their status. I think the largest number of Kurds are living in Turkey. They have majority of them, those who can speak Kirmanji. Kirmanji in Iran is not the dominant dialect. It is not the dominant dialect in Iraq. It is in Syria. Therefore, it is very different. I don't see why if we delink the question of rights from nation state, I don't see why we should go for this kind of sort of homogenizing elements. I find them unnecessary. I find them at most even, I think, harmful. But let us also, the point that we are making about Barzanis are going to make create a nation, uniform state. I know little about Kurdish politics, but on the basis of the little I know, I find this as an entirely unrealistic statement. Let's leave it at that.
Teşekkür ederiz. Sorunun bir kısmında Martin'e sorulmuştu. Sorulardan bir tanesi hem Vali hem Brünesen'e sorulmuştu. Yeah. Vali cevap verdi. Şimdi sen istiyorsan.
Yeah. Okay. There was one question about the relation of KDP and PKK, and I think the reason why these two parties are the sole significant political forces is that they're armed. They have force of arms. It is interesting to see that they have very different political projects. KDP has a very traditional political project. It is difficult to find any original political idea when you speak to people of the KDP. I mean, they just think autonomy and now perhaps statehood is the one way. In that respect, the experiment with non-state forms of self-determination of the PKK is very interesting. It also means that they will have two very different relations. For both, I think, the most significant state will be Turkey. The KDP used to be oriented towards Baghdad, but it is more and more turning towards Turkey as the most significant partner in dialogue. So Turkey will be speaking to two very different types of Kurds, having two very different kinds of projects, which perhaps was not, it looks like a divide and rule policy. In the end, Ankara seems to be very much more significant than it used to be. There was also a question about what language will Kurds speak among themselves. Well, I think they will continue speaking all these different dialects. People who do have dealings with people of another dialect learn to understand that dialect and speak it to some extent. And we see now journals that publish articles in both of these dialects, and that will continue to be the case, and I don't think there's any reason for a single dialect to become the dominant one. But we will see that politically, these two dialects will become associated with these two different projects of the two different parties.
İki soru var.
Evet. Let me start with the first question about the relation between the PKK and socialism or communism, as you want to name it, like that. Let me start by saying that the PKK, when it was established, it aimed at a societal transformation. And if we have to talk about relevant others in the context of that societal transformation, there were two relevant others, and that were Kemalism and feudalism. And in that sense, I may have a different opinion than Martin when he said it's Turks and Iraqi Kurds. I think it's Kemalism and feudalism. It's very important to emphasize that because the PKK, to my opinion, has never been a nationalist party. So feudalism and Kemalism. And the way to go to that transformation for the PKK was a struggle for socialism, at the time interpreted as a project also of state building. What we have seen recently, over the last 10 years, that they have critiqued their own project of societal transformation in terms of a state-building project, and that they try to rethink that project of societal transformation, an alternative for capitalism beyond real socialism. And the sources of that rethinking, has been utopian socialism, has been very strongly the work of a radical ecologist, a former communist, later anarchist, Murray Bookchin. We have a very profound influence of Murray Bookchin on the rethinking of a project of socialism, so to say, in the PKK, away from a state building and a statist idea. The second question was about the construction or the working on democratic confederalism in spite of the existence of a system of nation states in which people live. And maybe I could illustrate the answer or start the answer by making a reference, I think, to Foucault, who said that when you resist against something, you also create it. Yeah? You can't escape the thing you resist against. You reproduce it. What we see in the work of the PKK today is that they say, well, our primary focus is not a resistance against the nation state. So leave that aside. And let's try to rethink and work on the alternatives as we want to have them. And while working on that, try to render irrelevant the institutions of the nation state, the symbols of the nation state, the borders of the nation state. I think that is very strongly present in the work of the PKK, in the writings of its members, also of course in the writers of Öcalan. And then let me finalize with something which characterizes the PKK very strongly and which also links to an earlier question on violence. The PKK has, I think, a very actionist approach. Identity, alternatives, but also identity is created in struggle. I think Handan also referred to that when she said it's not only the discourse which led to a changing position of women, but also the action, eylem, not only söylem, but also eylem. The transformation takes place in the struggle, and that is also reflected in their slogan, Berge dan Eziane. To struggle is to live, to struggle is to live, not the other way around. In that sense, and maybe we get a discussion in the panel, I also do not really believe in the Verelendungs theory that counter-violence created the identity. I think it's in the struggle that the attempt of identity creation, of transformation, is present in the work of the PKK. And well, with that I want to end.
Öncelikle hoş geldiniz. Pamukkale Üniversitesi'nden gelen arkadaş. Şimdi farklı düşünüyorum dediniz ama ben aslında çok farklı düşünmediğiniz kanaatindeyim. Sorduğum soru, yani soyun Türk olmasının garantisi ne derken aslında şuna vurgu yapıyordum. Yani böyle bir alandan konuşuyorsanız aynı zamanda kadınların bedenlerinin, cinselliklerinin denetim altına alınmasından da konuşuyorsunuz. Zira soyun Türk olmasının garantisi kadınların cinselliğinin ya da Kürt olmasının ya da Rus olmasının fark etmez. Yani mesele Türklük değil, mesele burada saflığın korunması saplantısının ancak kadınların cinselliklerin denetlenmesinden geçiyor olması. Vurgulamak istediğim buydu. Bir diğeri işçi ve asker. Yani milliyetçi pratikler açısından baktığımızda kadınların milletin devamının sağlanması beklenebilir. Kapitalist üretim süreci açısından baktığımızda aslında çağlar boyunca ta cadı avlarından, yani kadınların, ebe kadınların cadı olarak yakılmasından günümüze değin beden politikaları, kadınların bedenleri, cinsellikleri, doğurganlıkları üzerindeki bütün denetimin esas olarak nüfus politikaları ile ilgili olduğunu görüyoruz. Nüfus politikalarında iki temel şeyi siz söylediniz. Çalışacak işçiler, 3 çocuk, 5 çocuk, aslında aynı zamanda bunun savaşacak askerler. Dolayısıyla hani burada kadınların bedenlerinin denetlenmesi, konumuz milliyetçilik olduğu için bu bağlamda dile getirdim, fakat kapitalist üretim süreci açısından baktığınızda herhalde Başbakanımızın 3 ya da 5 çocuk istemesinin aynı zamanda Türkiye'nin tekstilde Çin'le yarışacak düzeye gelmeye çalışmasıyla da alakası vardı diyeyim. Kimlikler, şimdi beyaz Türk olmak, siyah olmak, kadın olmak, aslında burada biz bunları söylediğimiz için olmuyor. Mesela benim kendi adıma yaptığım kimlik söylemini yapı sökümüne uğratmak. Yani bunun altında ne var? Eğer sınıf açısından söylüyorsanız şunu belirtilebilir. Kesinlikle toplumsal cinsiyet ve etnisite gibi farklı güç ve iktidar ilişkileri tarafından belirlenen konumların sınıf meselesinden bağımsız olmadığı, sınıf sömürüsünün çoğunlukla toplumsal cinsiyete ya da etnisiteye dayalı hiyerarşilerden de yararlanarak ve bu ayrımları kendine eklemleyerek ve büyüterek devam ettiğini belirtmek mümkün diyebilirim.
Tamam.
Evet hocam.
Efendim yeni bir set alalım. Kısa soruların yeni bir setini alalım.
Yeterli.
Var mı? Buyurun.
Hocam itiraz var.
Pardon.
Yeterlilik.
I thought we had to start at 3, but to stop at 3:30, right?
Şimdi dedik son oturum olduğu için istediğim kadar uzatalım. Peki. O zaman yalnız bu bu şeyden, yönetimden artık bitirelim şeyi geldi. Siz buyurun.
Açık mı? Evet. Benim sorum Abbas Veli olacaktı, resmi dille alakalı. Resmi dile sempatik baktığımdan değil ama şimdi bir işlevi var sonuçta pratikte. Hukukçu olarak hani kanun yaparken falan sürekli tıkanıyoruz böyle, ne olacak hani şimdi ne yapacağız? Teoriyi konuşmak, böyle hani idealleri konuşmak güzel oluyor ama nasıl uygulayacağız derken çok zorlanıyoruz. Resmi dilin alternatifi nedir? Ben onu merak ediyorum. Yani ne yapmalıyız? Nasıl bir yoldan gitmeliyiz?
Teşekkürler. Şimdi 2 tane veya 3 tane de 20 saniyeden daha uzun soru alalım. Sen sormuştun galiba ama ne olur anlıyorsun beni değil mi? Ha. Yani yönetimle beni karşı karşıya getirme.
Peki hocam. Şimdi KDP'nin tüzüğüne ve geçmişine baktığımızda temel nihai amaç olarak KDP'nin geçmişine, tüzüğüne baktığımızda nihai amaç olarak 4 parçanın birleşmesinden oluşan tek parça ve bağımsız bir Kürdistan devleti. Ancak şu anda bağımsız Kürdistan...
Ne bu soru?
Abbas Valiye. Şu anda bağımsız Kürdistan sadece Güney Kürdistan için düşünülüyor. Diğer parçalardaki hareketler özellikle PKK, Türkiye'nin, işte YPG'nin Suriye Ulusal Koalisyonu ile birlikte hareket etmesi isteniyor. Bunun temel sebebi ne? Acaba KDP Güney Kürdistan'da bir bağımsız devlet ilan ederken komşularından gelebilecek bir çevreleme ve bir ambargodan mı korkuyor? Bu bağlamda diğer parçalardaki Kürtleri Güney Kürdistan bağımsızlığı için kurban etmiyor mu? Teşekkür ederim.
Başka var mı efendim? Efendim, buyurun. Mümkün olduğunca kısa.
Öncelikle merhaba. Pamukkale Üniversitesi'nden İlyas Aydemir. Geldim hocama soru sormak istiyorum. Yost hocama soru sormak istiyorum. Şu an siz şeyden bahsettiniz, demokratik özellikle demokratik konfederalizm. Şu an mesela Öcalan bunu geliştirip mesela Rojava üzerinde bir pratiğini biz görebiliyoruz. Şayet Rojava'da 1-2 yıl içinde bu pratik ürününü verdiği takdirde ve uluslararası arasında bir kazanım sağlandığında bunun diğer parçalar için nasıl bir önemi olacaktır? Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkürler. Başka var mı? Peki son 2 soru. Siz bir tanesini.
Teşekkür ederim. Benim sorum sayından bu sene kimlik bilincinde önemli unsurlara değindi. Bu unsurların aslında çok yeni olmadığını biliyoruz. Cumhuriyet kadroları da bunu denemişti. Şu anda içinde bulunduğumuz durum ortada. İşlerinden bir tanesi Türklerin de içinde bulunduğu bir asimilasyon. Aslında Türkler de çok büyük bir asimilasyona uğramıştır bu yapı içerisinde. Dolayısıyla bu yapının işlemediğini veya işlediğindeki durumu görüyoruz. Bize önerebileceği başka bir kimlik, yani oluşum süreci olabilir mi? Mesela Gezi'deki idealler birliği veya hayırlar birliği gibi bir önerisi var mı acaba?
Teşekkür ederiz. Son olarak Profesör Kimliği. Evet. Versene.
Just want to make a very short comment and thank you for it. National liberation movements are not a recent event. There is an experience of national liberation movements. National liberation movements that eventually constituted its state transformed themselves into a movement of national liberation to a movement of national oppression. The example of my own history shows that very well. I was a Zionist when I was a young man. Zionism has moved from being a movement of national liberation to being a criminal, oppressive movement. In that regard, I think that the experience has to be present to all those who, the Kurdish people, and all those who...
We barely understand you, Professor.
Huh? Sorry?
We don't hear you.
Ah, okay. Start again? Okay, thank you. I want to say that national liberation movements are always have existed from a very long time. And the national liberation movements exist because of the various reasons that we have been discussing here. When national liberation movements constitute themselves into nation states, they transform themselves from being national liberation to being national oppression, movement of national oppression. This is a continuous and very painful process. I want to bring my own experience, and it's personal. I was a young Zionist when I was young. I went to live in Israel, and now Israel has become, from being a national liberation movement, the Zionist movement has become a criminal movement, a criminal oppressive movement. In that regard, the experience has to be present with the Kurdish people you want to constitute a state, remember that the population that is going to live in your state is not going to be all Kurdish, and that you have to, if you constitute a nation state, you will find yourself in the same predicament as your oppressors. Thank you.
And this question was addressed to? Everyone, okay. Professor Wali.
Yes. I think first the question of official language. Look, I am talking about the legal aspects of a language in the Constitution. I see no reason to mention official language. I give you a very prominent example of Britain. I was an academic in Britain for 18 years, and I taught in the University of Wales, which has, an area which has a different language, like Kurdish is here, they speak Welsh. Welsh is not spoken by everybody, right? In the valleys, villages and so on, a lot more people speak it than towns. And in some towns, they speak it more than others. But the law was this in the university, that everything which was officially written in the university had to be bilingual. That means that every letterhead, every business card, every whatever it is in the university, every sign in university had to be bilingual. And I worked there for 18 years, I don't know more than few words of Welsh, like hello, good night, and this kind of things. But, if a Welsh student demanded that he or she wants to write her exam paper in Welsh, it was his or her right to do so. All I had to do had to take the paper to the Department of Welsh and had a professor of Welsh read it to me, and I graded. You see? But this did not mean, all the signs in the town are bilingual. All of them. All the way to motor, the highway to Wales is all bilingual. But this doesn't mean that the dominant language is not English. I taught it. Everybody spoke English. But that speaking English as a dominant language did not mean legal suppression of Welsh. And there is no such a word as official language in any document which makes up the unwritten constitution of Britain, England, right? But this cannot be in France. In Republican democracy, that is not possible. And you have taken that model of Republican democracy. What I'm arguing for, why do we have to create further troubles for us? Now, we all know that historically Turkish here, for the last several centuries, has evolved as the dominant language of science, of education, of administration. But why do we have to canonize this in the Constitution? And if we canonize it in the Constitution, are we aware of its likely consequences? We'll have to know what the consequences. It can have dire and disastrous consequences. If tomorrow a nationalist, Turkish hardline nationalist movement gains in elections, and it is not unlikely, everything can happen in politics. What can that force do with this idea of official language? To the Kurds, to the Laz, to whoever doesn't, mother tongue is not Turkish. This is nobody. I'm not disputing the fact that, historically Persian has evolved as the dominant language of Iran. I'm not disputing, I do enjoy Persian literature
I in fact like Persian literature and music more than I do, let's say, Kurdish. I was brought up in that culture. You see, that the point I'm making, but I see no reason to the way that they have done it in Iran. Why? Or in Iran, they say that the official religion is 12-er Shiism, which means that, you know, automatically the official language is Persian and the official religion is Shiism. That means that automatically about 20-25% of population are, by all intents and purposes, are not full citizens. You see, none of them can, nobody from Kurdish community can become prime minister. You see, this is in Iran. I mean, but why? I mean, if we have these historical examples in front of us, and we are going to make a constitution, why the Turkish intelligentsia, democratic intelligentsia, shouldn't stand up and say that, look, this is going to have this kind of dire consequences? Why not? You know, who can dispute the dominance of Turkish in this country? Historically has evolved. It's been like, it's language of administration, it's language of education. You know, but if you give similar rights to Kurdish there, it is okay. It is not going to violate it. And that is going to be spoken, that's going to be language of education or whatever. But if somebody wants to write his essay in Kurdish, let him write it. If somebody wants to do his master's dissertation in laws, let her do it. Why should this violate the identity of sovereign power? If sovereign power is so constituted, can actually be receptive to difference. But if sovereign power is not receptive to difference, that is not a good sovereign power. This is the problem that I am making. There's nobody, it's not going to be legal chaos, there's not going to be chaos in administration, nothing like that. But the point is that I am saying that we should stop the possibility of an impending catastrophe. Now that is the time to do so. We should say this. The other thing, the question was about KDP and PYD and Rojhalat. I think the person who asked the question. Look, I don't think the kind of discussions we are making here is conducive to kind of arguments you are putting forward about possibility of a united Kurdish state and so on, if that's what I understand. I do see the condition of possibility of such a state almost as the Americans say, zilch. You see, I don't see it there. And the other thing is that it's not just the condition of possibility of it, but its desirability. Politically, in democratic terms and so on, I think it is a highly debatable issue. And it should be debated. Emotional commitments to such projects are not always very good from my point of view.
Teşekkür ederim. Joost.
Thank you. I will take the question on Rojava as a possible example and the warning for liberation movements turning into oppressive movements together. What we see in Rojava is the practicing of democratic confederalism, autonomy, and when you talk with people, not only in Rojava, also when you talk to people in Diyarbakir who are active in the local councils, in the Mahalle Meclisler, they all say that we are learning by doing. So this is at the same time practicing something and exploring something, learning by doing. And what the result will be is of course unclear, and it's very difficult to say something about that. But we can say one thing in its favor, and that it's based on multiplicity. on a politics of multiplicity, and that connects to what Abbas Wali earlier said, the right to have rights. People have the right to have rights. For example, to organize their own education or to do things in the field of culture. This recognition of multiplicity in the politics of democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy is a very important one, and it also connects with what other speakers have said before in their critique on the nation state and its politics of homogeneity. So here we see something different. How it will evolve, as I said, no one knows. But I think, and this is also an invitation, that it is something which should be followed and which also should be researched by you as students. So let's hope that we can return one day to this conference hall and listen to your presentation about developments in Kurdistan and also developments in this field.
There was one question for me, and I'm not sure I understood it correctly. Did you suggest I had when speaking about identity, I had neglected that things like resistance as an identity, that can be an important element of identity. That is what you meant? Well, I agreed when you say that people who were at Gezi feel that this was perhaps the most important thing that they had done for a very long time. So they thought this as an important part of themselves and therefore as their identity. Certainly you can say that. I mean, there is a way of speaking of identities in the sense of these big identities, like a political identity like being a socialist, or a national identity being a Kurd, or a religious identity being a Muslim. These things exist, of course, but they're not homogeneous. You are not only a Kurd or a Muslim or a socialist. Besides that, you may like heavy metal music. You may have a certain group of friends who do not share your political or religious ideas, but who are friends nonetheless, who are therefore also part of your personal identity. You may have a particular sexual identity, which has nothing to do with these large ideas of religion and politics and nation and so on. And I think we can say that in the 2000s, that identities have become looser, and many people have many more identities than we would have seen a few decades ago. Lifestyles have become important. Lifestyle is a way of choosing a particular way of consumption, as opposed to others, in order to distinguish yourself from certain people or to belong to a group that you really happen to admire. This does not come in the place of a national or an ethnic identity, but it is an important additional thing that everyone, I think, has.
Sağ ol Martin. En yıpratıcı mesleklerden bir tanesi simültane çevirmenliktir. Onun için 2-2 çalışırlar. Tek kişi öldürür bu iş. Kendilerine teşekkür ediyoruz. Başta yabancı profesörler olmak üzere konuşmacılara teşekkür ediyoruz. Elçin ve Celil hocalara ve örgütledikleri öğrenci arkadaşlara teşekkür ediyoruz. Bir de sizlere teşekkür ediyoruz. Çünkü bu amfi galiba 67'de yapıldı. Ben 70'lerin sonundaki boykot forumlarından sonra ilk defa bu kadar kalabalık bir dinleyici topluluğu gördüm ki o boykot forumlarına katılan öğrencilerin yarısı sınıflardan zorla getirilmişti. Siz kendi kendinize geldiniz. Hiç şikayet etmeyin bu kadar geç çıktığınıza. Sağ olun.